In the cosmopolitan streets of Alexandria during the early centuries of the Common Era, Greek philosophers, Egyptian priests, Jewish scholars, and adherents of mystery religions exchanged ideas in a cultural melting pot unlike any the ancient world had known. From this ferment of cross-cultural dialogue emerged a body of texts attributed to a figure called Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the Thrice Greatest, a syncretic deity combining the Greek god Hermes with the Egyptian god Thoth. These texts, collectively known as the Hermetica, would exert a profound influence on Western philosophy, science, and spirituality for nearly 2 millennia. They proposed a vision of the cosmos as an interconnected whole, governed by divine intelligence and accessible to human understanding through both rational inquiry and spiritual insight. Hermeticism offered not merely a system of abstract metaphysics, but a practical path of transformation, promising that human beings could ascend from material existence to unite with the divine source of all reality. This ancient philosophy would disappear from European consciousness for centuries, only to burst forth with renewed vitality during the Renaissance, shaping the thought of some of the period's most brilliant minds. Understanding Hermeticism requires us to step into a world where philosophy and religion had not yet diverged into separate domains, where knowledge of the natural world was inseparable from spiritual wisdom, and where the boundaries between Greek and Egyptian, rational and mystical, material and divine, were constantly being negotiated and redefined. The figure of Hermes Trismegistus stands at the intersection of multiple cultural traditions. The Greeks identified their god Hermes, messenger of the Olympians, and patron of travelers, merchants, and eloquence, with the Egyptian god Thoth, the ibis-headed deity of writing, magic, and wisdom. Thoth was credited in Egyptian tradition with inventing hieroglyphs, establishing religious rites, and recording the judgment of souls in the afterlife. He embodied the power of language and knowledge, serving as scribe to the gods and keeper of divine secrets. When Greek culture encountered Egyptian civilization following Alexander's conquests in the 4th century BCE, this identification became formalized in what scholars call interpretatio graeca, the Greek practice of recognizing foreign deities as local versions of their own gods. But Thoth Hermes became something more than a simple equation between two pantheons. He evolved into Hermes Trismegistus, a legendary sage who supposedly lived in Egypt's distant past and authored works containing the accumulated wisdom of both civilizations. The epithet Trismegistus, meaning thrice greatest or 3 times great, may have derived from Egyptian priestly formulae that emphasized divine power through repetition. This Hermes was imagined not as a mythological deity, but as an ancient prophet or priest king who had achieved such profound understanding that later ages venerated him as a source of primordial revelation. The historical reality behind Hermes Trismegistus is considerably more complex than the tradition itself suggests. Modern scholarship has established that the Hermetic texts were not written by a single ancient Egyptian sage, but were composed by multiple Greek-speaking authors in Egypt, primarily during the first 3 centuries of the Common Era. These authors drew on Greek philosophy, particularly Platonism and Stoicism, while incorporating elements of Egyptian religion, Jewish theology, and Persian cosmology. The texts emerged from the vibrant intellectual culture of Roman Egypt, where traditional Egyptian religion coexisted with Greek learning, Gnostic speculation, and early Christian theology. Alexandria, with its famous library and museum, served as the primary center for this cross-cultural synthesis. The city hosted communities of Greek philosophers who studied Plato and Aristotle, alongside Egyptian priests maintaining ancient temple traditions, Jewish scholars interpreting Hebrew scriptures in Greek, and diverse religious groups seeking salvation through mystical knowledge. From this milieu came texts presenting themselves as revelations from Hermes, written in Greek, but claiming to preserve Egyptian wisdom from before the time of Moses and Plato. These texts created a fictional antiquity that granted them enormous authority. Renaissance scholars, rediscovering them centuries later, believed they were reading the oldest philosophy in the world, predating even the Greek masters they so admired. The syncretic nature of Hermetic thought reflects the broader religious and philosophical currents of the late Hellenistic and early Roman imperial periods. This era witnessed what scholars call the Second Sophistic, a revival of interest in classical Greek culture, alongside growing enthusiasm for Eastern religions and mystery cults promising personal salvation. Traditional civic religion no longer satisfied many educated people who sought more immediate connection with the divine and assurance of immortality for the soul. Philosophy itself was becoming increasingly religious, emphasizing not just logical argument, but spiritual exercises, contemplation, and moral transformation. Platonism, which had begun as Socratic dialectic in Athens, evolved through Middle Platonism into what would become Neoplatonism, a grand metaphysical system uniting rational philosophy with mystical aspiration. Stoicism taught that divine reason pervaded the cosmos, and that human beings could achieve wisdom by aligning themselves with universal nature. Mystery religions like those of Isis, Mithras, and Dionysus offered initiations into sacred knowledge. Gnostic groups taught that the material world was a prison from which the soul must escape through Gnosis, or revelatory knowledge. Jewish Hellenism, represented by thinkers like Philo of Alexandria, reinterpreted Hebrew scripture through Greek philosophical categories. Early Christianity was formulating its theology in dialogue with all these traditions. The Hermetic texts participated fully in this intellectual ferment, synthesizing elements from multiple sources into a distinctive vision. The Hermetic corpus itself divides into two broad categories that scholars term the philosophical Hermetica and the technical Hermetica. The philosophical texts, primarily preserved in the collection known as the Corpus Hermeticum, consist of dialogues and revelatory discourses on theology, cosmology, and spiritual transformation. These are the texts that would captivate Renaissance humanists and later esotericists. They present Hermes as a wise teacher instructing pupils in the nature of God, the structure of the cosmos, and the path by which human beings can achieve gnosis and ascend to divine unity. The technical Hermetica, by contrast, are practical manuals on astrology, alchemy, magic, and medicine. These texts, far more numerous than the philosophical works, provided instructions for manipulating natural and supernatural forces, making talismans, compounding medicines, interpreting celestial omens, and communicating with spiritual entities. While modern readers often distinguish sharply between philosophy and magic, ancient practitioners saw them as complementary. Knowledge of cosmic principles naturally implied the ability to work with those principles. Understanding the correspondences between celestial and terrestrial realms meant one could use that understanding practically. The technical Hermetica applied the cosmological theories of the philosophical texts, translating abstract principles into concrete operations. The philosophical Hermetica present a coherent worldview, though individual texts show considerable variation in emphasis and terminology. At the heart of Hermetic teaching lies the conviction that the cosmos is a unified living being, pervaded by divine intelligence and structured according to principles that human reason can grasp. God, or the One, is the transcendent source of all existence, utterly beyond human conception, yet intimately present throughout creation. The cosmos emanates from this divine source in hierarchical levels, descending from pure intellect through soul and the celestial spheres to the material world. Human beings occupy a unique position in this cosmic hierarchy. We combine material bodies drawn from the four elements with rational souls that participate in divine intelligence. We are microcosms containing within ourselves the entire structure of the macrocosm. This gives us both tremendous dignity and grave responsibility. Through spiritual discipline and philosophical inquiry, we can ascend through the cosmic levels, shedding material encumbrances and reawakening our divine nature. The goal of Hermetic practice is not escape from the world, but conscious realization of our true identity as divine beings temporarily inhabiting material form. This realization, called Gnosis, transforms our relationship to existence itself. The historical development of Hermeticism can be traced through several distinct phases, though dating and sequencing individual texts remains controversial. The earliest Hermetic writings probably date to the 1st century CE, emerging from the same intellectual context that produced Gnostic texts, Jewish apocalyptic literature, and early Christian writings. These texts address fundamental questions about divine transcendence, the origin of evil, the nature of matter, and the possibility of salvation. They show strong Platonic influence, particularly the cosmology of Plato's Timaeus, which describes the creation of the world by a divine craftsman or demiurge. They also incorporate Stoic physics and ethics, drawing on the Stoic concept of logos as divine reason organizing the cosmos. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Hermetic texts were being composed that engaged more directly with Neoplatonic philosophy as developed by Plotinus and his successors. These later texts show greater philosophical sophistication and more elaborate metaphysical hierarchies. The technical Hermetica continued to be composed throughout late antiquity, with astrological and alchemical texts being produced well into the Byzantine and Islamic periods. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, knowledge of Greek declined in Western Europe, and the philosophical Hermetica disappeared from Latin consciousness. They survived in the Greek-speaking Byzantine world and, significantly, in Arabic translation, where they influenced Islamic philosophy and science. The Arabic transmission of Hermetic texts deserves particular attention, as it shaped later European reception in crucial ways. Beginning in the 8th century, the Abbasid Caliphate sponsored an enormous translation movement in Baghdad, rendering Greek philosophical, scientific, and esoteric texts into Arabic. The Hermetic corpus was extensively translated, studied, and commented upon by Islamic scholars. The Emerald Tablet, perhaps the single most influential Hermetic text, first appears in Arabic sources from this period, attributed to Hermes but of uncertain origin. Arabic philosophers like Al-Kindi, Al-Razi, and Ibn Sina engaged with Hermetic ideas on the structure of matter, the relationship between celestial and terrestrial phenomena, and the theoretical foundations of alchemy. The Sabians of Haran, a religious community in northern Mesopotamia, were identified by some Islamic writers as followers of Hermes, preserving ancient star worship and philosophical wisdom. Whether or not this identification was accurate, it linked Hermeticism with living religious practice rather than just textual tradition. When Latin Christians began translating Arabic works in the 12th century, Hermetic texts entered Western Europe primarily through this Arabic channel. The Emerald Tablet, for instance, became known to medieval Europeans through Latin translations of Arabic versions. This transmission route meant that Hermetic ideas arrived in medieval Europe already integrated with Islamic Neoplatonism, astrology, and alchemy, shaped by centuries of Arabic commentary. Medieval Latin Christendom had limited direct access to Hermetic texts, but was nonetheless influenced by Hermetic ideas mediated through other sources. Translations of Arabic works on astrology, alchemy, and magic frequently cited Hermes as an authority. The influential medical work Picatrix, translated from Arabic in 13th century Spain, contains extensive Hermetic material on celestial magic and astrological talismans. Medieval alchemical texts regularly invoked Hermes as the founder of their art, and the emerald tablet circulated as a fundamental alchemical scripture. Thomas Aquinas, the great scholastic philosopher, mentioned Hermes Trismegistus in his writings, acknowledging him as an ancient wise man who had glimpsed monotheistic truth before Christ. However, the full Corpus Hermeticum remained unknown to medieval scholars. They could not read Greek, and no complete Latin translation existed. Hermetic philosophy thus exerted influence primarily at the margins of medieval thought, in the domains of magic and alchemy that official theology treated with suspicion. The technical Hermetica found eager readers among those seeking practical knowledge of natural and supernatural operations, while the philosophical vision of cosmic unity and human divinity remained largely inaccessible. This situation changed dramatically in the 15th century. The recovery and translation of Hermetic texts during the Italian Renaissance created what historians have called a Hermetic moment in European intellectual history. In 1463, an agent of Cosimo de' Medici, ruler of Florence, acquired a Greek manuscript containing 14 tractates of the Corpus Hermeticum. Cosimo immediately commissioned his court philosopher Marsilio Ficino to translate them into Latin, interrupting Ficino's work on Plato's dialogues because he was elderly and wanted to read the Hermetic texts before he died. This interruption itself reveals the immense prestige Hermes commanded. Ficino and his contemporaries believed they were reading divine revelation granted to an Egyptian prophet who lived before Moses, making Hermetic wisdom older than Hebrew scripture and Greek philosophy. The texts seem to confirm Christian truth through independent ancient testimony, showing that pagan wisdom at its highest recognized the Trinity, creation from nothing, and the Incarnation. Renaissance humanists embraced Hermeticism as Prisca Theologia, the ancient theology that had been granted to humanity in its earliest ages, and from which all later philosophy derived. Hermes, along with Moses, Zoroaster, Orpheus, and Pythagoras, formed a chain of ancient wisdom culminating in Plato and ultimately fulfilled in Christianity. This belief in Hermetic antiquity shaped Renaissance thought in profound ways. If Hermes had known truths about God and cosmos that classical philosophers like Plato had later expressed in different form, then ancient wisdom confirmed rather than contradicted Christian revelation. Philosophy, magic, and religion could be unified within a single sacred tradition. The Renaissance recovery of Hermeticism coincided with renewed interest in Neoplatonism, Jewish Kabbalah, and Christian mysticism. Thinkers like Giovanni Pico della Mirandola synthesized these various traditions, arguing that beneath apparent diversity lay fundamental unity. Pico's famous Oration on the Dignity of Man drew on Hermetic anthropology, presenting human beings as created without fixed nature so that we might freely shape ourselves and ascend to union with God. This Hermetic optimism about human potential contrasted sharply with the Augustinian emphasis on original sin and human depravity that had dominated medieval theology. Renaissance Hermetists celebrated human creative power, our ability to understand and manipulate nature, and our destiny to become divine through knowledge and virtue. This vision animated the artistic, scientific, and magical projects of the Renaissance, from Ficino's astral medicine to Giordano Bruno's cosmic philosophy to the Rosicrucian manifestos of the early 17th century. The prestige of Hermeticism collapsed in 1614 when the classical scholar Isaac Casaubon demonstrated through philological analysis that the Corpus Hermeticum could not have been written in remotest antiquity. Casaubon showed that the text's Greek style, philosophical vocabulary, and theological concepts clearly dated them to the early Christian era rather than pre-dynastic Egypt. They were not pristine revelations from before Moses and Plato, but products of the Hellenistic synthesis between Greek and Egyptian culture. This revelation destroyed the historical foundation of Renaissance Hermeticism. If the texts were not ancient, they lost their authority as independent confirmation of Christian truth and source of primordial wisdom. Scholarly interest in Hermeticism waned dramatically. The texts came to be seen as historical curiosities, examples of religious syncretism and late antique mysticism, but without philosophical significance. This negative reassessment lasted for centuries. Only in the 20th century did scholars begin to appreciate Hermetic philosophy on its own terms, regardless of its date, recognizing it as a sophisticated synthesis of Platonic, Stoic, and Egyptian thought that addresses perennial questions about cosmic order, human nature, and spiritual transformation. Understanding Hermeticism today requires balancing several perspectives simultaneously. We must recognize the texts as products of a specific historical context while appreciating their philosophical substance and later influence. We must distinguish the ancient Hermetica from medieval Arabic developments, Renaissance Christian interpretations, and modern esoteric appropriations. We must acknowledge both the philosophical and technical strands of the tradition, understanding how abstract cosmology connected to practical application. And we must appreciate how Hermetic ideas, whether or not we accept their truth claims, have shaped Western thought in lasting ways. The Hermetic principle that humanity is a microcosm reflecting the macrocosm has informed everything from Renaissance natural magic to contemporary holistic medicine. The vision of the cosmos as an interconnected living whole has influenced ecological thinking and systems theory. The emphasis on direct experiential knowledge rather than mere bookish learning resonates with phenomenology and existentialism. The conviction that matter and spirit form a continuum rather than an absolute dualism has shaped alternatives to Cartesian metaphysics. Hermeticism, in short, remains philosophically live, even after we have abandoned belief in its historical claims. The figure of Hermes Trismegistus, though mythical, represents something real and significant, the human aspiration to unified knowledge that integrates observation of nature, rational inquiry, spiritual insight, and practical wisdom. The ancient authors who wrote under his name sought to articulate a comprehensive worldview that would make sense of both physical and metaphysical reality, that would explain the origins of the cosmos and the destiny of the soul, that would show how knowledge and virtue enable transformation. They believed that truth was one even if approached through multiple paths. They held that the same principles governed the movements of stars and the thoughts of minds, that correspondences linked every level of reality, that understanding these connections was both intellectually satisfying and existentially transformative. Whether we share these convictions or not, we can recognize in them a perennial philosophical impulse. The drive to achieve synoptic understanding that unifies disparate domains of experience into coherent vision. Hermeticism offered one influential answer to the question of how to integrate knowledge into wisdom. As we explore the Hermetic tradition in what follows, we will examine the major texts and teachings that comprise this philosophical system. We will consider the cosmological vision presented in the Corpus Hermeticum, the famous dictum of the Emerald Tablet, the 7 principles articulated in later Hermetic synthesis, and the spiritual path of Gnosis and regeneration that transforms the human practitioner. We will trace Hermetic influence through late Antiquity, its transmission through Islamic civilization, its Renaissance revival, and its legacy in modern Western esotericism. Throughout this exploration, we will approach Hermeticism as serious philosophy, deserving careful attention rather than dismissing it as mere mysticism or occultism. The texts reward close reading. They raise important questions about divine transcendence and immanence, the relationship between thought and reality, the connection between knowledge and ethics, and the possibility of human transformation. By engaging these questions thoughtfully, we can appreciate why Hermeticism has fascinated so many across so many centuries, and why its vision of cosmic unity and human potential continues to speak to contemporary seekers of wisdom. The Corpus Hermeticum, the central collection of philosophical Hermetic texts, consists of 18 tractates or libelli presenting dialogues and revelatory discourses attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. These texts, composed in Greek during the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, offer profound meditations on the nature of divinity, the structure and origin of the cosmos, the constitution of human beings, and the path to spiritual knowledge and transformation. While each tractate possesses its own character and emphasis, together they articulate a coherent philosophical and religious vision that synthesizes Platonic metaphysics, Stoic physics and ethics, and Egyptian religious sensibility into something genuinely new. The Corpus Hermeticum addresses the fundamental questions that preoccupied late antique philosophy. What is the relationship between the one and the many? How did the cosmos arise from primordial unity? What is the nature of matter, and why does evil exist? What are human beings, and what is our proper relationship to the divine? Can we achieve salvation, and if so, how? These questions animate not just Hermeticism, but the entire philosophical culture of the early imperial period, from Plutarch and Philo through the Middle Platonists to Plotinus and the Neoplatonists. The Hermetic texts provide one distinctive set of answers that both participated in and influenced the larger conversation. The first tractate of the Corpus Hermeticum, known as the Poimandres, or Divine Poimander, stands as the most famous and influential text in the collection. The title Poimandres means shepherd of men, or possibly mind of sovereignty, referring to the divine intelligence that reveals itself to Hermes in the text. The tractate presents itself as a visionary revelation in which Hermes receives knowledge directly from the cosmic mind. The narrative framework resembles both Greek philosophical dialogues and Jewish apocalyptic literature, combining rational exposition with mystical disclosure. Hermes tells how once, when his thoughts turned to ultimate realities, his bodily senses fell dormant and a vast being appeared to him, identifying itself as Poimandres, the mind of absolute sovereignty. This being asks what Hermes wishes to learn, and Hermes replies that he wants to understand the nature of reality and to know God. What follows is a cosmogonic myth describing the origin of the universe, the creation of humanity, and the soul's fall into and potential redemption from material existence. This myth would profoundly influence Gnostic and Neoplatonic creation narratives, and it establishes the fundamental Hermetic vision of cosmic structure and human destiny. The Poimandres creation account begins with the divine mind, which is God, existing as pure light and life before anything else exists. This mind generates the word or logos, which is the Son of God and the divine creative principle. What we find here is clearly influenced by Platonic notions of divine intellect and creative reason, as well as by Stoic concepts of logos as rational principle pervading nature, and possibly by Jewish wisdom, literature, and early Christian logos theology. From the divine mind proceeds a dark, downward-tending nature that becomes matter, which the text associates with water and earth. The divine mind contemplates its own beauty, and, seeing its reflection in the watery depths of primordial matter, becomes enamored of itself. This self-contemplation is the beginning of creation. The word sounds forth and separates the elements, organizing chaos into cosmos. 7 planetary spheres are established, governed by Hymarmene or fate, and these revolve in eternal cycles. This sevenfold cosmic structure, drawn from Hellenistic astronomy, provides the framework for both Hermetic cosmology and the later concept of the soul's descent through the planetary spheres. The celestial realm of divine intellect and the material realm of nature now stand separated yet connected, establishing the fundamental polarity within which human existence unfolds. The creation of humanity in the Poimandres occupies a central position in Hermetic anthropology. The text describes how the Father, the sovereign mind, produces a second mind who is the demiurge or craftsman of the physical world. This demiurge creates the 7 planetary governors who rule the material cosmos through fate. But then the Father mind creates an anthropos, a primordial human or divine man, in his own image, beautiful and beloved. This original human being is purely spiritual, possessing the full creative power of the divine mind. He descends through the planetary spheres, and at each level, the planetary governors give him some of their own nature and power. When this divine anthropos reaches the lowest sphere and looks down into material nature, he sees his own reflection in the waters below. Nature, seeing his beautiful form, falls in love with him just as mind had fallen in love with its own reflection. The divine anthropos, drawn by desire, descends into matter and unites with nature. This union produces physical humanity as we know it, beings composed of divine mind and mortal body, carrying within themselves both celestial light and terrestrial darkness. We are thus fundamentally dual creatures, and this duality explains both our misery and our potential for redemption. This myth of the soul's descent into matter establishes several crucial Hermetic doctrines. First, human beings are not simply created by the demiurge like other animals, but bear the direct image of the supreme God himself. We possess divine intelligence and creative power in our essential nature. Second, our descent into material embodiment resulted not from sin or punishment, but from desire, from the soul's attraction to its own reflected beauty in the natural world. There is something ambiguous and even tragic about this descent, yet it is not simply a fall into evil. Third, our current state combines divine and material elements inextricably. We are microcosms containing the entire structure of the macrocosm. The 7 planetary forces that govern the cosmos also operate within us as passions and faculties. The divine mind that creates and sustains all things lives within us as our rational capacity. Fourth, our composite nature means we face a choice. We can identify with our mortal, material aspect and remain trapped in the cycles of generation and destruction, or we can awaken to our divine nature and ascend back through the planetary spheres to unity with God. This choice between ignorance and gnosis, between material and spiritual existence, constitutes the fundamental existential situation that Hermetic practice addresses. The path of ascent described in the Poimandres prefigures the regeneration and divinization that later tractates elaborate. When a soul awakens to gnosis, recognizing its true identity as divine intelligence, temporarily clothed in matter, it can begin the journey upward. At death, the body returns to its elements. But the soul that has achieved knowledge does not simply dissolve or enter another cycle of reincarnation. Instead, it ascends back through the 7 planetary spheres, surrendering at each level the corresponding passion or limitation it acquired during its descent. At the sphere of the moon, it yields up growth and decay. At Mercury, cunning and deception. At Venus, erotic desire. At the Sun, mental ambition. At Mars, rashness and anger. At Jupiter, the love of wealth. At Saturn, falsehood and evil plotting. Stripped of all these material accretions, the soul arrives in the 8th sphere, the sphere of fixed stars, possessing only its own proper power. Then it enters the 9th sphere and finally achieves unity with God, becoming itself divine. The text describes the culmination with striking language. Each soul becomes a power in God, and altogether they become God. This is not absorption and loss of identity, but recognition of original identity. The soul realizes that it always was divine, though it had forgotten this truth during its sojourn in matter. Gnosis is remembering what we truly are. The Poimandres concludes with Hermes transformed by his vision. Having received this revelation, he becomes a teacher and prophet, proclaiming the message of Gnosis to others. He calls people to awaken from the drunken sleep of ignorance, to recognize their divine nature, and to begin the path of ascent. The text emphasizes that this knowledge is not for everyone. Those who are entirely identified with bodily existence, enslaved by the desires and fears of material life, cannot hear the message. Only those whose minds are already beginning to stir, who sense there must be more to existence than eating, sleeping, reproducing, and dying, can respond to the call. This elitism is characteristic of many ancient wisdom traditions, which held that philosophical truth required both natural aptitude and strenuous effort. The Hermetic texts often present themselves as sacred books to be carefully guarded and shared only with worthy students. At the same time, they insist that Gnosis is potentially available to any human being precisely because we all possess divine mind. The limitation lies not in some predetermined elect, but in the willingness to undertake the difficult work of self-knowledge and transformation. Other tractates in the Corpus Hermeticum develop and elaborate themes introduced in the Poimandres. Tractate 4, often called the Mixing Bowl or the Crater, describes how the Father filled a great bowl with mind and sent it down to earth so that souls who desire understanding could baptize themselves in it and achieve Gnosis. This tractate emphasizes that God actively desires human salvation and provides the means for it, but we must choose to participate. Those who plunge into the crater of mind are transformed, receiving knowledge and becoming perfect. Those who reject this opportunity remain ignorant and mortal. Tractate 5, that God is invisible and most manifest, meditates on divine transcendence and immanence. God cannot be seen with physical eyes or conceived by ordinary thought, yet God is more manifest than anything else, being present in all things as the power that sustains their existence. The text plays with paradox. God is invisible, yet totally visible, incomprehensible yet known through everything we comprehend, without qualities yet the source of all qualities. This apophatic theology, which describes God through negations while insisting on divine presence, resembles the theological method developed more systematically by Neoplatonists like Plotinus and later Christian mystics like Pseudo-Dionysius. Tractate 10, the Key, presents Hermes instructing his son Thoth in fundamental doctrine. The text emphasizes that true teaching must engage not just intellectual understanding, but moral and spiritual transformation. Thoth must learn to separate himself from the chaos of bodily sensations and appetites, to still his mind, and to receive the divine word that brings illumination. The tractate describes the cosmos as a great animal or living being in which every part connects to every other part through sympathia or cosmic sympathy. This Stoic concept of universal interconnection becomes central to Hermetic thought, explaining how astrology works, how magical operations can affect distant things, and how the microcosm of humanity relates to the macrocosm of the universe. The doctrine of cosmic sympathy underlies the entire technical Hermetica, providing the theoretical foundation for practices like making talismans, compounding sympathetic medicines, and invoking celestial powers. It also has profound philosophical implications, suggesting that the cosmos is not a mechanical aggregate of discrete parts, but an organic unity in which everything participates in divine life. Tractate 11, Mind to Hermes, consists of a discourse on intellect delivered by personified mind or nous. The text distinguishes sharply between human beings who possess nous and those who do not. To have nous means to have achieved gnosis, to have awakened divine intelligence within oneself. Such a person sees through material appearances to the eternal realities they manifest. Those without nous, by contrast, remain trapped in opinion and sensation, unable to grasp genuine truth. This distinction is not between smart and stupid people, but between those who have undergone spiritual transformation and those who have not. The tractate insists that nous cannot be taught in the way ordinary subjects can be taught. One can provide instruction, arguments, and guidance, but the actual awakening of nous comes as a gift of God to those who prepare themselves through purification and contemplation. This emphasis on divine grace working together with human effort characterizes Hermetic soteriology. We must do our part through virtuous living and intellectual discipline, but the final transformation requires God's initiative. The text concludes by identifying nous with God himself, present within the human soul. To know God is to activate the nous that we always already possess. Tractate 12, Hermes to Thoth on the Common Intellect, develops the doctrine of nous further. The text asserts that while not all human beings actualize their intellectual capacity, all possess it potentially. The divine mind permeates the entire cosmos, like light permeating air. Just as air makes light visible only when it encounters an illuminated object, so individual minds make the divine intellect manifest only when they turn toward it and receive it. The tractate draws an important distinction between the demiurge or maker god, who is good and creates the material world, and the supreme God who is beyond even goodness. This hierarchy resembles Middle Platonic and Neoplatonic schemes, distinguishing the utterly transcendent one from the creative intellect that proceeds from it. The text also discusses the problem of evil. Since God is good and creates all things, how can evil exist? The answer given is that evil is not a positive reality, but a deficiency, the absence or privation of good. Matter in itself is not evil, but the soul's entanglement with matter and forgetfulness of its divine nature constitutes the condition we call evil. Virtue consists in remembering our true nature and living according to divine intellect rather than bodily passion. Tractate 13, The Secret Sermon on the Mountain, presents Hermes teaching Thoth about spiritual rebirth or regeneration. This text has particular importance because it describes the actual process of transformation in some detail. Thoth asks his father to explain regeneration and to help him experience it himself. Hermes responds that rebirth cannot be taught but only undergone, and that it requires the gracious gift of God. However, he can prepare Thoth by describing what happens. Regeneration occurs when the powers of God replace the 12 torments of matter that ordinarily dominate human existence. These 12 torments are ignorance, grief, incontinence, desire, injustice, greed, deceit, envy, fraud, anger, recklessness, and malice. One by one, divine powers drive these torments out. Knowledge replaces ignorance, joy replaces grief, self-control replaces incontinence, and so forth through the entire list. When this transformation completes, the person becomes a different being, deified or made godlike. Hermes leads Thoth through a visionary experience of this regeneration, and Thoth emerges transformed, able to perceive reality with spiritual senses rather than bodily ones. The doctrine of regeneration in Tractate 13 illuminates the practical goal of Hermetic philosophy. The point is not simply to learn certain doctrines intellectually, but to undergo an actual transformation of consciousness and character. The text insists repeatedly that this transformation is real, not merely metaphorical. The person who achieves regeneration literally becomes divine while still living in a mortal body. They participate in the eternal life of God even while subject to temporal existence. This creates what we might call a realized eschatology. Salvation is not something awaiting us after death, but something we can actualize in the present through philosophical and spiritual practice. The regenerate person still inhabits the material world and engages in ordinary activities, but they do so from a radically different center of identity. They know themselves as divine mind temporarily using a human body rather than as a body that happens to think. This shift in self-understanding changes everything about how one lives and relates to the world. The regenerate person has achieved what the tradition calls apatheia, not apathy in the modern sense, but freedom from domination by passions and external circumstances. A stable peace rooted in identity with eternal truth. Additional tractates in the Corpus Hermeticum explore various aspects of Hermetic teaching. Tractate 14 addresses health and disease, relating bodily conditions to cosmic and psychic forces. Tractate 16 on kingship presents the ideal of the philosopher king who rules through wisdom rather than mere force. Several shorter tractates consist of prayers, hymns, or brief revelatory pronouncements. Together, these 18 texts provide a comprehensive, if not always systematic, presentation of Hermetic philosophy. Modern readers must remember that these were not composed as a single work by one author with a unified plan. They represent multiple voices within a tradition, different teachers and students exploring similar themes with individual emphases. Some texts show stronger Platonic influence, while others draw more heavily on Stoic ideas. Some emphasize cosmic mysticism, while others focus on ethical transformation. Some use elaborate mythic imagery, while others employ abstract philosophical argument. This diversity enriches rather than undermines the tradition, showing how Hermetic principles could be articulated in multiple registers. The Corpus Hermeticum is not the only collection of philosophical Hermetic texts. The Asclepius, a dialogue between Hermes and his student Asclepius, survives in a Latin translation and overlaps thematically with the Corpus Hermeticum while introducing some distinctive elements. The Asclepius describes in detail the Egyptian practice of statue animation, where priests would draw down spiritual powers into physical images, essentially creating living gods. This section scandalized Christian readers, but represents an important Hermetic principle, that spirit and matter can interpenetrate, that divine presence can inhabit material forms, and that human beings have the creative power to facilitate this incarnation. The Asclepius also contains a famous apocalyptic passage describing the coming destruction of Egyptian religion and wisdom. This lament for Egypt's lost glory resonated with Renaissance readers who saw themselves as recovering ancient treasures nearly lost to history. The dialogue emphasizes human uniqueness as beings who participate in both divine and earthly natures, calling us a great miracle and worthy of worship and honor. This exalted anthropology, which sees human beings as almost equal to the gods in dignity and power, became one of Hermeticism's most distinctive and influential contributions to Renaissance humanism. In addition to these major collections, various fragments and excerpts from Hermetic texts are preserved in the works of Christian church fathers, who quoted them while arguing against pagan philosophy. Lactantius, writing in the early 4th century, cited Hermetic passages extensively to show that even pagan philosophers recognized the truth of monotheism and divine providence. Augustine, less favorably disposed toward Hermeticism, nevertheless preserved important passages while criticizing what he saw as demonic magic. The Neoplatonist philosopher Iamblichus incorporated Hermetic teaching into his synthesis of theurgy and philosophy. The Byzantine philosopher Michael Psellus compiled excerpts from Hermetic texts in the 11th century. These scattered fragments supplement our knowledge of Hermetic thought beyond what the main collections preserve. They also demonstrate that Hermeticism was taken seriously by ancient and medieval thinkers as a significant voice in philosophical and theological debate, not dismissed as mere superstition or charlatanry. The divine mind or nous that stands at the center of Hermetic theology deserves careful consideration as a philosophical concept. In the Hermetic system, mind is not primarily human rationality, but the cosmic intelligence that creates and orders all things. It is both transcendent, existing beyond and prior to all creation, and immanent, pervading everything that exists and making it intelligible. This dual nature recalls Plato's distinction between the realm of eternal forms and the material world of becoming, as well as Aristotle's concept of divine intellect as pure self-thinking thought. The Stoics had already conceived of logos as both divine reason and universal natural law operating throughout the cosmos. Hermetic nous synthesizes these Greek philosophical conceptions with a more personal and mystical theology. Mind is not just an abstract principle, but a being who cares about human salvation, who reveals himself through visions and interior illumination, who desires that souls awaken to their true nature. At the same time, achieving union with divine mind requires philosophical understanding, not just emotional devotion. One must grasp intellectually the structure of reality, the nature of causation, and the principles governing cosmic order. Gnosis combines rational insight with spiritual transformation. The relationship between the supreme God, divine mind, and the demiurge or creator God in Hermetic texts has generated considerable scholarly debate. In some passages, God and mind seem identical, different names for the same ultimate reality. In other texts, mind appears as the first emanation or self-expression of an even more transcendent divine principle. The demiurge who shapes matter into cosmos sometimes seems to be identified with mind and sometimes appears as a distinct subordinate deity. These apparent inconsistencies may reflect different authors working within the same broad tradition, or they may represent genuine philosophical tensions that the Hermetic writers struggled to resolve. The problem of how absolute transcendent unity gives rise to multiplicity without compromising its unity preoccupied all late antique philosophers. Plotinus developed an elaborate system of hypostases or ontological levels proceeding from the ineffable one through intellect and soul to matter. Hermetic texts seem to be groping toward a similar solution without achieving the systematic clarity of Plotinus. What remains constant is the insistence that the divine principle, however many names or levels it receives, is essentially mind, and that human beings participate directly in this divine intelligence through their own capacity for intellectual understanding. Understanding the Corpus Hermeticum requires situating it within the wider world of late antique religious philosophy. These texts belong to the same cultural moment that produced the Nag Hammadi, Gnostic library, the Chaldean oracles, the writings of Philo of Alexandria, the Enneads of Plotinus, the mystical theology of Origen, and the theurgy of Iamblichus. All these traditions wrestled with similar questions and drew on similar philosophical resources, yet each developed distinctive answers. Gnosticism tended toward a more radical dualism, viewing matter as evil and the material creator God as ignorant or malevolent. The Hermetic texts, while acknowledging the soul's problematic entanglement in matter, generally affirm the goodness of creation and see matter as the necessary medium through which spirit manifests. Neoplatonism developed more rigorous metaphysical systems and emphasized philosophical argumentation over revelatory discourse. Hermeticism combined rational philosophy with mystical experience, presenting its teachings as both logically demonstrable and divinely revealed. Christianity insisted on the unique incarnation of God in Christ and salvation through faith and grace. Hermeticism held that divine incarnation happens in every awakened human being and that salvation comes through self-knowledge. These different traditions sometimes influenced each other and sometimes competed for adherence, creating the rich, diverse intellectual landscape of the late Roman world. The The continuing philosophical interest of the Corpus Hermeticum lies not in its historical priority, which Casaubon definitively disproved, but in its substantive vision of cosmic order and human potential. The texts articulate a form of panentheism in which everything exists within God, while God remains more than the sum of all things. They propose that mind and matter, while distinct, form a continuum rather than absolute dualism, and that consciousness is fundamental rather than emergent. They offer an account of moral evil as ignorance and forgetfulness rather than willful disobedience or ontological corruption. They insist on the possibility of radical transformation through direct knowledge rather than just incremental improvement through ethical discipline. They envision the cosmos as an organic whole in which every part relates to every other part through intelligible connections, not as a mechanical aggregate of externally related pieces. These are live philosophical options that continue to attract thinkers dissatisfied with mechanistic materialism on the one hand and supernatural theism on the other. Whether one accepts Hermetic metaphysics or not, the texts raise important questions and propose challenging answers that deserve serious engagement. Among all Hermetic texts, none has achieved greater fame or exerted wider influence than the Emerald Tablet, a brief and cryptic work attributed to Hermes Trismegistus that became the foundational scripture of Western alchemy. The text consists of fewer than 15 sentences, yet these few lines contain what practitioners have considered the complete secret of the great work, the key to understanding both the structure of reality and the method for spiritual and material transformation. The tablet's most famous line, "As above, so below," has become proverbial far beyond alchemical and esoteric circles, expressing in 4 words the Hermetic principle of correspondence that links microcosm to macrocosm and suggests that understanding one level of reality provides insight into all levels. The history, interpretation, and influence of the Emerald Tablet offer a remarkable case study in how a short, obscure text can generate centuries of commentary, inspire artistic and scientific work, and shape the imagination of Western culture in ways both obvious and subtle. To understand the tablet requires examining its mysterious origins, its dense and polyvalent language, its alchemical appropriation, and its philosophical implications. The Emerald Tablet first appears in Arabic sources from the 8th or 9th century. The earliest known version occurs in the Kitab Sir al-Khalika, or Book of the Secret of Creation, attributed to Apollonius of Tyana, the legendary Greco-Roman sage and wonder-worker. This work claims to record how Apollonius discovered the tablet in a cave or underground chamber, where he found the ancient Hermes seated on a throne, holding the inscribed emerald in his hand. Whether this text was actually written by someone named Apollonius or pseudonymously attributed to him remains unclear. What we can say with certainty is that the Emerald Tablet was circulating in Arabic translation by the 9th century at the latest. From Arabic, it was translated into Latin during the 12th century, when European scholars began systematically translating Arabic scientific and philosophical texts. Multiple Latin versions circulated during the Middle Ages, showing minor variations but maintaining the core content. The tablet thus entered European consciousness through the same channel that transmitted Arabic alchemy, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy to the Latin West. This transmission history matters because it meant medieval and Renaissance readers encountered the tablet already embedded within Islamic alchemical tradition and commentary. The text of the Emerald Tablet, even in modern English translation, retains much of its riddling character. It begins with a declaration of truth. True it is, without falsehood, certain and most true. This opening insists on the reliability and importance of what follows, a common convention in esoteric texts claiming to reveal hidden wisdom. The tablet continues with its famous central principle. That which is below is like that which is above, and that which is above is like that which is below, to accomplish the miracles of one thing. This is the statement usually summarized as above, so below, though the actual text is more precise and complex. It asserts both similarity and purpose. The correspondence between upper and lower realms exists to enable operations, to accomplish the miracles or marvels of the singular unified reality underlying apparent multiplicity. The text then describes a cosmogonic process, and as all things have been and arose from one by the mediation of one, so all things have their birth from this one thing by adaptation. Everything originates from primordial unity through the creative agency of that unity, and all multiplicity remains fundamentally related to and dependent on that source. The tablet proceeds to allegorical description of the great work using familial and elemental metaphors. The sun is its father, the moon its mother, the wind has carried it in its belly, the earth is its nurse. These statements describe the generation of the philosopher's stone, or the production of the spiritual regeneration. Solar and lunar, masculine and feminine, volatile and fixed, celestial and terrestrial, all must combine in proper relationship. The text emphasizes process and transformation. Separate the earth from the fire, the subtle from the gross, sweetly with great industry. This instruction applies simultaneously to chemical operations in the alchemical laboratory, to the refinement of metals, to the purification of the soul, and to the attainment of spiritual knowledge. The tablet's language deliberately operates on multiple levels, allowing and even requiring readers to discover meanings appropriate to their concern and level of understanding. The concluding statements assert the text's universality and power. Thus you will have the glory of the whole world, therefore all obscurity shall fly from you. Complete knowledge brings enlightenment and dispels ignorance. This is the strong force of all force, for it vanquishes every subtle thing and penetrates every solid thing. The power described transcends ordinary physical force, operating on the spiritual and intellectual planes that underlie material manifestation. The Emerald Tablet's historical origins remain obscure and debated. Unlike the Corpus Hermeticum, which can be situated with reasonable confidence in the Hellenistic world of the early Common Era, the tablet's provenance is genuinely uncertain. Some scholars argue that it represents an originally Greek text translated into Arabic and then into Latin. The cosmological content and vocabulary resemble ideas found in Greek alchemy and Neoplatonism, supporting a Hellenistic origin. Others suggest it may have been composed in Arabic by Islamic alchemists synthesizing Greek alchemical theory with Islamic philosophy. The attribution to Apollonius of Tyana, if it carries any historical weight, might date the text to late antiquity, though most scholars regard the attribution as legendary. The tablet could date from anywhere between the 1st and 8th centuries CE. This uncertainty, while frustrating to historians, had the effect of enhancing the text's mystique. Without clear authorship or date, readers could imagine it as immeasurably ancient, perhaps inscribed on imperishable emerald by Hermes himself in primordial Egypt. The Renaissance belief in the extreme antiquity of Hermeticism applied even more strongly to the Emerald Tablet, which seemed to preserve the quintessential secret in concentrated form. Medieval and Renaissance alchemists treated the Emerald Tablet as sacred scripture, requiring interpretation through layers of allegorical meaning. Dozens of commentaries were written attempting to unlock its secrets. The Andalusian alchemist Abu Abd Allah Muhammad ibn Umayl, writing in the 10th century under the Latinized name Senior Zadith, produced an influential commentary relating the tablet to alchemical procedures for transmuting base metals into gold. In the Latin West, figures like Albertus Magnus, Roger Bacon, and John Dee studied and commented on the tablet. Each generation of alchemists found new significance in its compressed verses, discovering principles of chemical operation, cosmological structure, and spiritual transformation. The tablet became a kind of Rorschach test for alchemical theory. Whatever one's approach to alchemy, the tablet's ambiguous language could be read as confirming that approach. This interpretive flexibility contributed to the text's endurance and influence. Where more explicit works became dated as alchemical practice evolved, the tablet remained perpetually relevant because its meaning could adapt to new understanding without requiring change to the sacred words themselves. The principle of correspondence articulated in the Emerald Tablet has philosophical implications extending far beyond alchemy. The claim that above and below, macrocosm and microcosm, mirror each other constitutes a fundamental metaphysical assertion about the structure of reality. It denies that the cosmos is random aggregation, or that different levels of existence are ultimately disparate and unrelated. Instead, it proposes systematic connection. The same patterns, principles, and relationships recur at every scale. The motions of planets in the heavens correspond to the circulation of fluids in the body, the generation of metals in the earth, the purification of the soul through spiritual discipline, and the operations of alchemists in the laboratory. Understanding any one of these processes provides insight into all the others because they instantiate the same universal principles. This doctrine of universal analogy has obvious applications to astrology, which assumes that celestial configurations influence terrestrial events through meaningful correspondence rather than mechanical causation. It undergirds talismanic magic, which uses materials corresponding to celestial powers to channel those powers into the physical world. It informs traditional medicine, which treats disease by restoring balance among humors that correspond to elements, planets, and cosmic forces. The philosophical tradition underlying the correspondence principle stretches back to Plato's theory of forms and the Neoplatonic doctrine of emanation. Plato argued that sensible things participate in transcendent forms that serve as their eternal archetypes. A particular beautiful object is beautiful because it participates in the form of beauty itself. The visible world thus corresponds to and imperfectly mirrors the intelligible realm of forms. Plotinus developed this into a hierarchical system where each level of reality proceeds from the level above it while remaining connected through ontological dependence and formal similarity. The lower reflects the higher imperfectly but genuinely. The Hermetic principle adds the dimension of operational significance. These correspondences are not just static structural relationships, but enable practical operations. If you understand the connections, you can manipulate one level to affect another. You can work with material substances according to their celestial correspondences to produce transformations that would be impossible through mechanical causation alone. This operative magic, based on sympathetic relationships rather than efficient causality, defines the technical Hermetica and medieval natural magic. Renaissance natural philosophers embraced the correspondence principle enthusiastically, seeing in it confirmation that nature operates according to hidden but discoverable sympathies and antipathies. Marsilio Ficino's treatise on obtaining life from the heavens describes how to use herbs, stones, music, and images corresponding to beneficial planetary influences to draw down those influences for health and vitality. Ficino carefully distinguished this spiritus magic, which worked through natural correspondences, from demonic magic that invoked fallen angels. By grounding his practice in Hermetic and Neoplatonic philosophy of cosmic sympathy, he could present astral medicine as legitimate natural philosophy rather than forbidden sorcery. Paracelsus, the radical Swiss physician, made correspondence central to his medical theory. He taught that every disease has a corresponding remedy in nature, that the physician must study signatures in plants and minerals, that reveal their medicinal properties, and that healing requires understanding how macrocosmic forces affect the microcosm of the human body. As above, so below became for Paracelsus both therapeutic principle and philosophical axiom. Nature is a book written in correspondences that the wise physician learns to read. Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa's monumental 3 books of occult philosophy, published in 1533, provided the most comprehensive Renaissance synthesis of correspondence theory. Agrippa systematized the cosmic hierarchies and sympathetic relationships that natural magicians might employ, drawing on Hermetic, Neoplatonic, Kabbalistic, and Christian sources. His work catalogues correspondences among planets, elements, humours, metals, stones, plants, animals, angels, demons, and divine names, creating elaborate tables that map the connections linking every level of the great chain of being. For Agrippa, as for other Renaissance magi, the Emerald Tablets principle validated the entire enterprise of natural magic. If above and below genuinely correspond, then ceremonial magic, astrological medicine, alchemical transmutation, and spiritual ascent all rest on the same philosophical foundation. They are different applications of universal law rather than superstition or delusion. Critics of magic, including church authorities, attacked this claim, arguing that apparent magical effects came from demonic deception rather than natural correspondence. The debate over natural versus demonic magic preoccupied 16th century intellectuals and played a role in both the scientific revolution and the witch hunts. The Hermetic principle of correspondence stood at the centre of these controversies. The alchemical interpretation of the Emerald Tablet focuses particularly on the process of transmutation described symbolically in the text. Alchemists read the tablet as describing the stages through which base matter must pass to become gold, both the literal metal and the spiritual perfection it symbolizes. The union of sun and moon, male and female, signifies the conjunction of purified substances in the alchemical vessel. The carrying in the belly of wind represents fermentation or the development of transformative potential. Separation of earth from fire refers to the repeated distillations and crystallizations through which impurities are removed and essence concentrated. The ascent from earth to heaven and descent back to earth describes circulation within the vessel as sublimed vapor condenses and falls back to be re-sublimed again, each cycle refining the substance further. The entire great work proceeds through these operations until the perfect medicine or philosopher's stone results. This stone, itself refined from base matter through correspondence with celestial influences, possesses the power to transmute other base metals into gold because it embodies the universal principle underlying all metallic forms. Alchemical gold is not just valuable metal, but regenerated prime matter that has returned to its original perfection. The spiritual interpretation of alchemy, which coexisted with literal chemical practice, read the Emerald Tablet as describing the soul's transformation through mystical death and rebirth. The base matter is the unregenerate soul identified with bodily passions. The operations of separation, purification, and conjunction represent ascetic discipline, meditation, and divine grace working together to refine consciousness. The repeated circulations are cycles of spiritual practice, each deepening the practitioner's detachment from material concerns and identification with eternal truth. The final product is the regenerated soul that has achieved Gnosis and become divine. This spiritual alchemy need not involve chemical apparatus at all, though many practitioners pursued both literal and spiritual work simultaneously, seeing them as parallel applications of the same principles. The Emerald Tablet's language accommodates both readings. When it says, "Thus you will have the glory of the whole world," it can mean possession of the philosopher's stone that brings wealth and health, or attainment of Gnosis that confers understanding and spiritual power, or both at once. The ambiguity is not confusion, but deliberate multivalence, reflecting the Hermetic conviction that matter and spirit, physics and metaphysics, are not ultimately separate domains but different levels of one reality. Giordano Bruno, the controversial Dominican philosopher burned at the stake in 1600, provides a striking example of how the Hermetic principle of correspondence could inspire radical cosmology. Bruno accepted the Copernican heliocentric model, but extended it far beyond what Copernicus himself had proposed. For Bruno, influenced deeply by the Corpus Hermeticum and the Emerald Tablet, the universe was infinite and contained innumerable worlds orbiting innumerable suns. Each world was alive and unsouled, reflecting in its own way the infinite creative power of God. The principle, as above, so below, meant to Bruno that the same patterns repeat endlessly across all scales of existence. Humans are microcosms of Earth. Earth is a microcosm of the solar system. The solar system is a microcosm of the galaxy, and so on infinitely. God is not separate from this infinite universe, but immanent throughout it as world soul. Bruno's pantheistic interpretation of Hermeticism scandalized church authorities and contributed to his execution as a heretic. Yet it also anticipated modern cosmology's vision of a universe vast beyond imagining, yet governed throughout by consistent physical laws. The correspondence principle, freed from its literal astrological and alchemical applications, expresses the scientific conviction that understanding discovered in one domain applies across domains, that the same mathematics describes falling apples and orbiting planets, chemical reactions in test tubes, and stellar nuclear fusion. Isaac Newton's deep involvement with alchemy demonstrates how the Emerald Tablet and correspondence principle influenced even the founder of classical mechanics. Newton copied and translated numerous alchemical texts, including several versions of the Emerald Tablet. His extensive alchemical manuscripts, hidden from public view during his lifetime and for centuries afterward, reveal that he sought a unified science integrating mechanics, chemistry, and cosmology. Newton believed that gravitational attraction between masses might be a macrocosmic manifestation of the same occult sympathies that alchemists manipulated on the laboratory scale. He searched for the active principles underlying chemical reactions, convinced that transformations of matter obeyed laws as precise as his laws of motion, but currently hidden from view. The Emerald Tablets promise that understanding one thing unlocks understanding of all things resonated with Newton's drive to discover universal principles. While his mechanical philosophy and his alchemical investigations seemed contradictory to later readers, for Newton they were complementary aspects of the single quest to decipher the mathematical and spiritual principles by which God governs creation. The correspondence principle validated this unified approach. The Enlightenment and the triumph of mechanistic science relegated Hermetic correspondence to the category of discredited superstition. The new science explained natural phenomena through efficient causation, mathematical law, and experimental verification rather than occult sympathy and analogical reasoning. The Emerald Tablet came to be seen as mystical poetry at best, pre-scientific confusion at worst. Alchemy evolved into chemistry precisely by abandoning the search for universal correspondences in favor of systematic investigation of particular reactions and substances. Astrology lost intellectual respectability as astronomy developed mechanistic celestial mechanics. The principle, as above, so below, was dismissed as magical thinking, the fallacious assumption that superficial similarities between things indicate deep causal connections. Yet the correspondence principle never entirely disappeared. It persisted in Romantic nature philosophy, which rejected mechanistic reductionism and insisted on organic unity connecting all levels of reality. It influenced 19th century occult revivals, including spiritualism, theosophy, and the Hermetic order of the Golden Dawn. It found new expression in 20th century holistic and systems thinking, depth psychology's interest in synchronicity, and New Age spirituality. Carl Jung's concept of synchronicity represents a modern reinterpretation of Hermetic correspondence in psychological terms. Jung argued that meaningful coincidences, events connected by significance rather than causation, suggest that psyche and world participate in a shared order, transcending mechanical causality. The archetype manifesting simultaneously in the psyche and in external events exemplifies as above, so below, translated into the language of analytical psychology. Jung saw in alchemical texts, including commentaries on the Emerald Tablet, projections of the individuation process by which unconscious contents become integrated into consciousness. The alchemical transformation of base metal into gold paralleled the psychological transformation of the unconscious personality into the integrated self. Jung did not believe in literal transmutation or astrological causation, but he took seriously the psychological reality and therapeutic value of symbolic thinking that perceives meaningful correspondences. His work revalidated Hermetic symbolism as psychologically profound even after its cosmological claims had been scientifically superseded. The continuing philosophical interest in the correspondence principle connects to fundamental questions about the relationship between mind and world, pattern and instance, formal and efficient causation. Does similarity between structures at different scales indicate real ontological connection or merely human propensity to detect patterns? When we find the same mathematical structures describing phenomena at different scales, as we do in modern fractal geometry and chaos theory, does this support something like the correspondence principle? The Hermetic claim that microcosm reflects macrocosm finds surprising echo in contemporary physics' anthropic principle, which observes that the fundamental constants of nature seem remarkably fine-tuned to permit conscious observers like ourselves. Some interpret this as evidence that consciousness and cosmos are more intimately connected than mechanistic metaphysics allows. Others dismiss such speculation as Hermetic thinking in scientific disguise. The debate continues because the issues the Emerald Tablet raises remain unresolved. We do find astonishing correspondences across domains and scales. What those correspondences mean about reality's fundamental structure remains contestable. The Emerald Tablet endures as perhaps the most concentrated and influential expression of Hermetic philosophy precisely because its extreme compression invites perpetual reinterpretation. Each era discovers in its cryptic phrases confirmation of its own deepest insights about cosmic order and human possibility. Medieval alchemists found chemical procedures. Renaissance magi found operative magic. Enlightenment rationalists found mystical confusion. Romantic philosophers found organic unity. Depth psychologists found individuation. New Age spiritualists found consciousness creating reality. Each reading captures something the text's language can support, even if these interpretations contradict each other. This is not arbitrary subjectivism, but recognition that a genuinely profound statement about existence operates on multiple levels simultaneously. As above, so below names a genuine mystery about how different scales and modes of reality relate. The principle of correspondence points to real questions about pattern, similarity, hierarchy, and causation that philosophy and science continue to address. Whether one accepts the Hermetic answer or not, the question the Emerald Tablet poses remains essential. What is the relationship between the microcosm of human existence and the macrocosm of universal nature? How do part and whole, instance and archetype, material and spiritual relate? These questions ensure that even a text of fewer than 15 sentences can sustain millennia of meditation. The first and most fundamental principle articulated in the Kybalion is the principle of mentalism, stated as, the all is mind, the universe is mental. This principle asserts that ultimate reality is consciousness rather than matter, that mind is ontologically prior to physical existence, and that the material universe exists within and as a manifestation of universal mind. Everything we perceive as objective material reality is ultimately mental in nature, existing as thought or idea in the mind of the all, the infinite living intelligence that constitutes the ground of being. This teaching resembles philosophical idealism as developed by thinkers like Berkeley and Hegel, who argued that only minds and their contents truly exist, while also drawing on the Hermetic doctrine of divine, nous pervading all things. The Kybalion presents mentalism not as speculative metaphysics, but as practical key to spiritual development. If the universe is mental, then consciousness is primary and causally efficacious. Changing one's thoughts changes one's reality. Mental discipline becomes the fundamental spiritual practice, and understanding the laws governing mental phenomena provides mastery over existence. This principle undergirds the entire New Thought movement's emphasis on positive thinking and mind power. The principle of correspondence, stated as above, so below, as below, so above, directly invokes the Emerald Tablet and represents the Kybalion's genuine connection to historical Hermeticism. The book explains that this principle means the same patterns and laws operate on all planes of existence. The mental, spiritual, and physical realms, while distinct, mirror each other in their fundamental structure and operation. What is true on one level holds true analogically on other levels. Understanding visible phenomena provides insight into invisible principles, while grasping spiritual truths illuminates material processes. The Kybalion presents this as both cosmological fact and practical tool. By studying correspondence, the student can reason from known to unknown, inferring the nature of higher planes from experience of lower ones, and vice versa. The book emphasizes that correspondence does not mean identity. The planes remain distinct even while reflecting each other. The mental plane operates according to mental laws that differ in detail from physical laws, yet the fundamental patterns remain consistent. This principle validates both intellectual inquiry into nature and contemplative exploration of consciousness as paths to unified understanding. The principle of vibration states that nothing rests, everything moves, everything vibrates. The Kybalion teaches that the fundamental nature of reality is vibratory motion rather than static substance. From the highest spiritual frequencies to the densest matter, all existence consists of vibration at different rates. The differences between spirit and matter, between mind and body, between energy and mass, are differences in vibratory frequency rather than essential kind. This principle attempts to synthesize ancient Hermetic cosmology with modern physics understanding of energy and matter. The book presents a scale of vibration extending from the all at the highest frequency down through spiritual entities, mental states, vital energies, and physical matter at the lowest frequency. Raising one's vibration through spiritual practice, positive emotion, and mental discipline enables ascent through these levels toward union with the divine. Conversely, negative thoughts and base emotions lower vibration and entrap consciousness in denser levels. The principle of vibration thus provides both metaphysical framework and practical guidance for transformation. Like tuning a musical instrument to proper pitch, we can adjust our fundamental frequency through conscious will. The principle of polarity asserts that everything is dual, everything has poles, everything has its pair of opposites, like and unlike are the same. Opposites are identical in nature, but different in degree. Extremes meet. All truths are but half-truths. all paradoxes may be reconciled. This complex principle addresses the paradoxes and apparent contradictions that pervade existence. Heat and cold, light and darkness, love and hate, noise and silence appear as opposites, but are actually different degrees of the same thing. There is no absolute point dividing hot from cold, no fixed boundary between light and darkness. The spectrum is continuous, and what we call opposites are merely different locations on this spectrum. The Kybalion derives from this several practical applications. First, since opposites are identical in nature, transformation from one to its opposite is possible by adjusting degree. Hate can be transmuted into love by recognizing they are both manifestations of emotional intensity and progressively shifting along the spectrum. Second, this principle explains apparent paradoxes in spiritual teaching. Statements that seem contradictory may both be true because they identify different poles or perspectives on the same underlying reality. Third, mastery requires understanding how to work with polarity, neither rejecting one pole for its opposite, nor remaining stuck at extremes, but consciously navigating the spectrum. The principle of rhythm declares that everything flows, out and in, everything has its tides, all things rise and fall. The pendulum swing manifests in everything. The measure of the swing to the right is the measure of the swing to the left. Rhythm compensates. This principle addresses the temporal dimension of existence, the cycles and oscillations that characterize all phenomena. Day follows night, seasons cycle through the year, civilizations rise and fall, individual moods swing between elation and depression, success alternates with failure. The Kybalion teaches that rhythm operates with compensation and balance. The height of any swing in one direction determines the depth of the return swing in the opposite direction. This has significant psychological and practical implications. If one allows oneself to become too elevated during positive cycles, the compensating downswing will be correspondingly severe. The wise person learns to neutralize rhythm's effects by maintaining equilibrium, neither riding highs nor plunging into lows, but remaining centered. The book describes advanced techniques of mental polarization by which adepts can escape or minimize rhythm's influence. By refusing identification with the oscillating moods and conditions, by establishing consciousness at a higher level that observes but does not participate in the swings, one achieves relative freedom from rhythm while remaining subject to cosmic law. The principle of cause and effect states that every cause has its effect, every effect has its cause. Everything happens according to law. Chance is but a name for law not recognized. There are many planes of causation, but nothing escapes the law. This principle asserts universal determinism operating through hierarchical levels. Nothing occurs randomly or without cause, though the causes may be hidden from view or operating on planes inaccessible to ordinary consciousness. What appears as luck, accident, or chance merely indicates our ignorance of operative causes. The Kybalion distinguishes between being cause and being effect. Most people exist as effects, swept along by circumstances and external forces they neither understand nor control. The masters become causes, consciously generating effects through understanding and application of natural law. Rising above the plane where one is merely effect requires ascending to higher causal planes and learning to work from those levels. This principle connects to the Hermetic emphasis on Gnosis as liberating knowledge. Understanding causation frees one from blind fate. While lower laws continue to operate, one who grasps higher laws can use them to direct and override lower-level causation. The principle thus promises not escape from law, but mastery through law. The seventh principle, the principle of gender, states that gender is in everything. Everything has its masculine and feminine principles. Gender manifests on all planes. The Kybalion is careful to distinguish metaphysical gender from biological sex, though it relates them analogically. At every level of reality, masculine and feminine principles operate creatively. The masculine principle is active, projective, generative, while the feminine principle is receptive, nurturant, gestative. Creation requires both in balanced relationship. On the mental plane, masculine consciousness actively generates ideas while feminine consciousness receives and develops them into form. On the spiritual plane, masculine spirit inseminates feminine soul. These gendered metaphors draw on ancient cosmogonic myths found across cultures, including Hermetic accounts of creation. The Kybalion presents gender not as biological accident, but as cosmic principle, essential to all creative process and manifestation. For modern readers, the book's gender essentialism and its assumption that masculine and feminine map neatly onto male and female bodies appears dated and problematic. Yet if we understand these terms as representing complementary dynamic principles rather than rigid biological categories, the principle raises genuine questions about polarity, creativity, and relationship in cosmic process. Evaluating the Kybalion's 7 principles requires distinguishing several questions. First, are these principles authentically ancient Hermetic teaching, transmitted secretly through initiates? The scholarly consensus is definitively no. The book shows clear influence from late 19th and early 20th century American spirituality, particularly the New Thought movement that emerged from transcendentalism and mental healing practices. Ideas about mind as creative power, vibration as fundamental reality, and mastery through understanding universal law pervade New Thought works like those of Prentice Mulford and William Walker Atkinson. The book's vocabulary and concerns are modern rather than ancient. Its emphasis on practical application for success and self-improvement reflects American pragmatism and optimism rather than ancient spiritual ascesis. The very concept of systematizing Hermeticism into 7 discrete principles, each with practical applications, reflects modern pedagogical concerns foreign to the dialogic and revelatory style of actual Hermetic texts. The Kybalion's pseudonymous authorship and claims to secrecy appear more as marketing strategy than genuine initiatic transmission. Second, do the 7 principles accurately represent the philosophy found in ancient Hermetic sources like the Corpus Hermeticum? Here the answer is more nuanced. Some principles genuinely reflect Hermetic themes, while others import foreign ideas. The principle of correspondence directly cites the Emerald Tablet and captures authentic Hermetic teaching about macrocosm and microcosm. The principle of mentalism, while not articulated as such in ancient texts, resonates with Hermetic emphasis on divine nous and the doctrine that mind creates and pervades reality. Ancient texts do describe emanation from unity to multiplicity and the soul's oscillation between divine and material poles, which relates to principles of polarity and rhythm, though not in the Kybalion's specific formulations. The principle of gender appears more questionable as ancient doctrine, though Hermetic cosmogonies do employ masculine and feminine imagery. The principles of vibration and cause effect reflect modern scientific and philosophical concerns more than ancient cosmological speculation. The ancient texts show no particular interest in vibration as ontological category or in articulating deterministic universal causation. So the Kybalion represents at best a creative reinterpretation and systematization of genuine Hermetic themes filtered through modern concepts. Third question. Regardless of historical authenticity, do the 7 principles have philosophical merit and utility? Here assessment becomes more subjective and depends on one's metaphysical commitments. The principle of mentalism articulates philosophical idealism, a live option with distinguished advocates from Berkeley to contemporary philosophers of mind. Whether consciousness is ontologically prior to matter or emergent from it remains contested in philosophy and cognitive science. The principle of correspondence expresses the perennial intuition that patterns recur across scales and domains. Modern science validates this in specific instances while rejecting global analogical reasoning. The principle of vibration attempts to ground metaphysics in physical theory, which is philosophically interesting even if the specific claims are scientifically naive. The principle of polarity addresses real phenomena of gradation and spectrum in qualities previously thought absolute. Contemporary recognition of continuums in sexuality, gender, mental health, and many other domains where binary categories were assumed validates the principle's core insight. The principle of rhythm identifies genuine cyclical patterns, while the psychological advice about maintaining equilibrium has practical value independent of cosmological claims. The principle of cause and effect asserts universal determinism, or at minimum universal lawfulness, which accords with scientific naturalism even as quantum indeterminacy complicates the picture. The promise that understanding causation grants control reflects the Enlightenment faith that knowledge is power, a claim with both truth and significant limitations. The principle of gender raises important questions about complementarity, polarity, and creativity in process philosophy and feminist epistemology, though it requires critical examination to separate useful insight from essentialist gender ideology. So the principles mix genuine philosophical issues, questionable metaphysical assertions, practical psychological wisdom, and modern repackaging of ancient themes in ways that make wholesale acceptance or rejection too simplistic. Each principle deserves individual evaluation on philosophical rather than historical grounds. The Kybalian's influence in contemporary spirituality far exceeds its scholarly standing. The book remains in print continuously since publication and has spawned extensive commentary and application. New Age teachers regularly cite the 7 principles. Self-help authors invoke Hermetic law to support claims about manifestation and mental causation. The principles appear in popular books on everything from business success to romantic relationships to personal development. This widespread influence stems from several factors. The principles offer a seemingly coherent metaphysical system accessible to non-specialists. They promise practical benefits through understanding and application. They invoke ancient wisdom and secret teachings, satisfying romantic desire for connection to mysterious tradition. They harmonize reasonably well with both scientific materialism and spiritual idealism, allowing interpretation from various perspectives. They provide vocabulary and conceptual framework for discussing experiences and intuitions that otherwise lack clear articulation. For many contemporary spiritual seekers, the Kybalion functions as their introduction to Hermeticism and their primary reference point for what Hermetic philosophy teaches. This situation creates tension between academic scholars of Hermeticism and popular practitioners. Scholars emphasize that the Kybalion is not ancient, that it misrepresents historical Hermeticism, that the 7 principles systematize in artificial ways. They worry that the book's popularity obscures genuine ancient texts and creates confusion about what Hermeticism actually taught. Popular practitioners respond that spiritual truth transcends historical accuracy, that living tradition matters more than textual purity, that usefulness counts more than authenticity. They argue scholars miss the forest for the trees, focusing on philological detail while dismissing practical wisdom. Both perspectives have legitimacy. Historical accuracy matters for understanding cultural history and intellectual development. Philosophical truth and practical efficacy matter for living spiritual practice. The ideal would be honoring both, studying ancient Hermetic texts carefully in their historical context, while also recognizing that modern reinterpretations even if historically inaccurate, may have philosophical value and practical benefit for contemporary practitioners. One might view the Kybalians' relationship to ancient Hermeticism as analogous to the relationship between ancient Hermetic texts and their alleged Egyptian origins. Renaissance scholars believed the Corpus Hermeticum preserved pristine Egyptian wisdom from remotest antiquity. Modern scholarship showed they were Hellenistic compositions synthesizing Greek and Egyptian elements. This historical correction did not destroy the philosophical interest or spiritual power of the texts themselves. Similarly, showing that the Kybalion is modern rather than ancient does not necessarily negate whatever philosophical insight or practical utility it possesses. The book participates in the ongoing process by which each era reinterprets received traditions in terms meaningful to its own concerns. That process has always characterized Hermeticism, from Greek authors writing in Egypt adopting Egyptian imagery, through Arabic scholars adapting Hermetic texts to Islamic philosophy, to Renaissance humanists reading Christian doctrine into Hermetic cosmogony, to contemporary spiritual teachers finding quantum physics and positive psychology in Hermetic principles. Tradition lives through creative reinterpretation and application to new contexts. The 7 principles can also be evaluated as philosophical articulation of experiential insights about consciousness and reality that recur across cultures and eras. Wisdom traditions worldwide recognize that mind shapes experience, that patterns repeat across scales, that opposites are interconnected, that existence involves cyclical change, that actions have consequences, and that creative process requires complementary principles. The Kybalians' formulation of these insights in systematic form, influenced by modern science and psychology, may not be ancient Egyptian, but the insights themselves point to perennial human recognitions about how existence operates. From this perspective, the Kybalion succeeds less as historical scholarship than as contemporary philosophy using Hermetic language to articulate universal truths. Whether one agrees with its specific metaphysical claims or not, the book addresses genuine philosophical questions and proposes answers worth consideration. Its widespread influence suggests it meets real needs for metaphysical orientation and practical guidance that academic scholarship alone does not satisfy. Moving forward in examining Hermetic philosophy, we will focus primarily on ancient texts rather than 20th century synthesis, while acknowledging that the Kybalion has shaped modern understanding of Hermeticism significantly. The principles it articulates provide useful entry point and organizing framework, even as we recognize they are interpretive systematization rather than direct transmission of ancient doctrine. In what follows, we will explore how ancient Hermetic texts actually conceive cosmological structure, human nature, and spiritual transformation. We will find themes that resonate with the Kybalians' principles, while also discovering emphases and nuances that modern systematization misses or flattens. By engaging both ancient sources and modern interpretations critically, we can appreciate the richness and complexity of the Hermetic tradition in its historical development and contemporary manifestations. The Hermetic vision of cosmic structure emerges from the synthesis of Platonic metaphysics, Stoic physics, and Egyptian religious imagination that characterized Hellenistic Alexandria. Ancient Hermetic texts present a universe that is hierarchically ordered, vitally alive, intelligently structured, and purposefully created. This cosmos emanates from a transcendent divine principle, unfolds through levels of decreasing spirituality and increasing materiality, and operates according to sympathetic correspondences, linking every part to every other part, and all parts to the divine whole. Understanding Hermetic cosmology requires grasping several interconnected concepts: the nature of the divine source from which all things proceed, the process of emanation by which multiplicity emerges from primordial unity, the hierarchical structure of cosmic levels from pure intellect through soul and celestial spheres to elemental matter. The relationship between spirit and matter as poles of one reality rather than absolute dualism, and the role of nous, or divine intelligence, as both transcendent creator and immanent ordering principle. These cosmological doctrines are not merely theoretical speculation, but have profound implications for how human beings understand their place in reality and the path of spiritual transformation available to them. At the apex of Hermetic cosmology stands the One, the absolute transcendent principle from which everything derives. Various texts use different names and descriptions for this ultimate reality. It is called God, the Good, the Father, the All, Being itself, the Monad. These designations attempt to point toward what exceeds conceptual grasp and verbal expression. The One is characterized primarily by negative theology. It is invisible, incomprehensible, ineffable, without qualities beyond being itself. Nothing can be truly predicated of it because predication implies limitation and determination, while the One transcends all limitation. Yet the One is not simply void or non-existence. It is infinite power, absolute self-sufficiency, perfect goodness, and the cause of all that exists. The texts struggle with the paradox of trying to describe what by its nature cannot be described, to speak about what transcends speech. They resolve this tension through both apophatic statements about what God is not and cataphatic statements about God's effects. We cannot know God's essence directly, but we can know God through creation, through the order and beauty and intelligence manifest in the cosmos. God remains hidden, yet reveals himself everywhere. This theological approach resembles Plato's discussion of the good beyond being in the Republic and Plotinus's elaborate analysis of the ineffable One in the Enneads. The process by which multiplicity emerges from the One is described through the metaphor of emanation. The One overflows or radiates existence the way the sun radiates light, not through deliberate action or decision, but through natural superabundance. Creation is not an event in time, but an eternal relationship. The cosmos always already exists as the self-expression of divine fullness. The first emanation from the One is mind or nous, the divine intellect that contains all the eternal patterns or logoe according to which particular things are formed. This nous is simultaneously the thought of God and the thinking that comprehends all things. In nous, subject and object, knower and known, remain unified. The forms or archetypal ideas exist not as separate static entities in some transcendent realm, but as the eternal thoughts of divine mind actively thinking itself. Some texts identify nous with God himself, while others present nous as the first creation, the Son of God who mediates between the utterly transcendent Father and the cosmos. This ambiguity reflects the difficulty of maintaining both divine unity and cosmic multiplicity, the same challenge that Plotinus addressed through his triadic scheme of one intellect soul. From nous proceeds soul or psyche, the principle of life and animation that pervades the cosmos and provides the connecting medium between eternal intellectual forms and changing material things. World soul contains the cosmos as its body and moves through it, imparting motion and life to all things. Individual souls are portions or rays of this universal soul, temporarily individuated yet remaining connected to their source. Soul occupies the intermediate position between pure intelligible reality and sensible physical reality. It participates in both domains, belonging to the eternal through its intellectual capacity, while engaging with temporal process through its vital animation of bodies. The relationship between nous and soul parallels the relationship between form and instantiation. Nous thinks the eternal patterns. Soul translates those patterns into temporal manifestation. This cosmological hierarchy of one nous soul establishes three primary levels of reality that will be articulated more systematically by the Neoplatonists, but appears in less technical form throughout Hermetic texts. The same structure recurs in various guises: God Logos, nature; Father Son Spirit; being intelligence life. The terminology varies, but the underlying pattern remains consistent. Below the intelligible realm of nous and the intermediate realm of soul lies the material cosmos itself, structured according to ancient astronomical and physical theory. The cosmos is spherical, with Earth at the centre surrounded by the 7 planetary spheres, beyond which lies the 8th sphere of fixed stars, and possibly 9th and 10th spheres of pure ether. The planets in ascending order are Moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, each ruling a specific domain of influence and associated with particular qualities, metals, and celestial forces. This geocentric system, drawn from Ptolemaic astronomy, was empirically adequate for ancient observations and formed the cosmological framework within which Hermetic philosophy developed. The planetary spheres are not just physical locations, but spiritual regions governed by divine intelligences or archons. Each sphere imparts to souls descending through it certain powers and limitations. The structure mirrors the internal human constitution. Within us exist faculties and passions corresponding to the 7 planets, making us microcosms containing the entire macrocosmic structure. The correspondence between celestial and terrestrial, macrocosm and microcosm, manifests most perfectly in human beings. Matter itself, the substrate of physical existence, occupies an ambiguous position in Hermetic thought. Some texts present matter in almost Platonic fashion as the principle of change, formlessness, and non-being that resists perfect realization of eternal forms. Matter is dark, heavy, downward tending, the source of multiplicity and division. Other texts adopt a more stoic view of matter as passive recipient of divine reason, neutral in itself, and capable of manifesting divine presence when properly organized by soul and nous. Matter is not evil, but merely the lowest level of cosmic emanation, the final stage where divine light becomes most dimmed and diffused. The material world is necessary for the complete self-expression of the divine. Without matter there would be no physical beauty, no living creatures, no embodied consciousness through which God comes to know himself in finite form. This more positive evaluation of matter and physical existence distinguishes Hermetic philosophy from radically dualistic Gnostic systems that view matter as evil and materiality as inherently corrupting. For Hermetic texts, the problem is not matter itself but the soul's forgetfulness of its divine nature and over-identification with material existence. Matter becomes obstacle only when the soul mistakes it for ultimate reality rather than recognizing it as temporary garment or vehicle. The relationship between spirit and matter in Hermetic cosmology is best understood as polarity within unity rather than absolute dualism. Spirit and matter represent opposite poles of one continuous reality. At the spiritual extreme we find pure light, immateriality, unity, eternity, consciousness, and activity. At the material extreme we find darkness, density, multiplicity, temporality, unconsciousness, and passivity. Between these poles exist infinite gradations. Spirit progressively densifies as it emanates downward through the cosmic hierarchy, becoming soul, then subtle pneuma, or breath, then ether, then the 4 elements earth, air, fire, and water, then compounds of elements. Conversely, matter is progressively spiritualized through the informing presence of soul and nous. There is no absolute boundary dividing spirit from matter. The entire cosmos is ensouled and intelligent to some degree. Even stones possess a dim reflection of divine life. Conversely, Even the highest spiritual beings require some substrate or vehicle for their existence and self-expression. This continuity allows for transformation in both directions. Matter can be elevated and spiritualized through philosophical and theurgic practice. Spirit can descend and become embodied for purposes of self-manifestation and self-knowledge. The soul's journey through incarnation and eventual return to divine source follows this cosmic pattern of emanation and reversion. The elements earth, air, fire, and water constitute the building blocks of physical matter in ancient physics. Each element has its natural place: earth at the center, then water, then air, then fire, extending to the lunar sphere. Motion occurs naturally when elements return to their proper place, and unnaturally when external forces move them elsewhere. The elements also possess qualities. Earth is cold and dry, water cold and wet, air hot and wet, fire hot and dry. Through shared qualities, elements can transform into each other. Fire becomes air through loss of dryness. Air becomes water through loss of heat, and so on. This theory of elemental transformation provided the physical foundation for alchemy. If elements can transmute into each other through alteration of qualities, then more complex substances, including metals, can likewise be transmuted. The alchemical great work sought to reverse cosmic emanation, refining gross matter back toward its spiritual source by removing material denseness and elevating vibratory level. This required understanding not just chemical procedures, but also cosmic correspondences, since elemental transformations in the laboratory parallel spiritual transformations in the soul, and both reflect eternal patterns in divine nous. Creation in Hermetic texts is described through several mythic accounts that differ in detail but share essential structure. The Poimandres describes how divine mind generates logos, or creative word, which organizes primordial chaos into ordered cosmos. The supreme God contemplates his own perfection, and from this self-contemplation flows the desire to create. Creation is not making something from nothing ex nihilo, but organizing formless potential matter according to eternal patterns. The demiurge or craftsman God shapes matter, while world soul animates it, and divine nous provides the intelligible forms that define each kind of thing. Some texts distinguish between the utterly transcendent supreme God and the demiurge, while others identify them. This created cosmos is good, beautiful, and perfect of its kind, reflecting divine intelligence and exhibiting purposeful design. The heavens move in perfect circular motion, never deviating. The seasons cycle regularly. Living things reproduce their kind. Natural processes exhibit the marks of wisdom and forethought. This teleological understanding of nature, where everything exists for a purpose and the whole displays intelligent design, contrasts sharply with the mechanical and evolutionary explanations that modern science would later develop. Time itself receives special attention in Hermetic cosmology. Eternity belongs to the divine realm where nothing changes, where all is simultaneously present in the eternal now of infinite consciousness. Time emerges with cosmic creation as the moving image of eternity. It is the measure of cosmic motion, particularly celestial rotation. The circular motion of the heavens generates time through cyclical return. Each completion of a cycle brings things back to their beginning. This conception of time as cyclical rather than linear had profound implications for astrology and for understanding history. Events recur in great cosmic cycles as the heavens return to previous configurations. The doctrine of eternal return, later associated with Stoicism and Nietzsche, finds expression in Hermetic texts. Everything that has happened will happen again as the cosmos completes its grand cycle and begins anew. Yet individual souls can escape this circular repetition through Gnosis that lifts them beyond time into eternity. The enlightened soul steps out of temporal succession into permanent presence. For such a one, time continues in the external world of appearances, but no longer characterizes the soul's inner reality. The question of evil in a cosmos created good by a good God preoccupied Hermetic philosophers as it did all ancient philosophical theologians. If God is perfectly good and creates all things, how does evil arise? Several answers appear in different texts. One approach, similar to Neoplatonic theodicy, denies evil any positive existence. Evil is mere privation or absence of good, deficiency rather than entity. Darkness is absence of light, ignorance absence of knowledge, vice absence of virtue. As emanation proceeds farther from its divine source, things become progressively less perfect, less unified, less good. But this gradual diminishment is necessary for creation to exist at all. Without distance from the source, without the many distinct from the one, there would be no creation. Another explanation locates the origin of evil in the soul's descent into matter and subsequent forgetfulness of its divine nature. Evil consists in this ignorance and the disordered desires and fears that flow from false identification with the body. A soul that knows its true identity and maintains connection to divine knows cannot act evilly even while inhabiting material form. Yet another approach attributes evil to fate or hymarmene, the deterministic causal sequences flowing from planetary influences. We are trapped in necessity, acted upon by cosmic forces we cannot control. Liberation comes through ascending beyond the planetary spheres to the region of freedom. The doctrine of cosmic sympathy or universal interconnection provides the theoretical foundation for both Hermetic cosmology and the practical operations of astrology and magic. The cosmos is not an aggregate of independent parts externally related by mechanical forces, but an organic whole in which every part is internally related to every other part through participation in the one divine life. What affects one part affects the whole, and the whole influences every part. Because everything proceeds from the same source and maintains connection to that source through the hierarchy of emanation, everything remains connected to everything else. The planets influence earthly events not through physical causation, but through correspondence and sympathy. Particular plants, stones, and animals have affinity with particular planets and can be used to channel planetary influences. This is not superstition, but logical consequence of organic cosmology. If the cosmos is alive and interconnected like a single vast animal, then working with part of it affects other parts just as stimulating. One organ affects the whole body. Modern rejection of astrology and sympathy magic stems not from demonstration that they don't work, but from adoption of mechanistic metaphysics that denies organic unity. If you assume reality is mechanistic aggregation, sympathy makes no sense. If you assume reality is organic unity, sympathy is inevitable. Hermetic cosmology ultimately serves spiritual purpose rather than merely satisfying intellectual curiosity. Understanding the structure of the cosmos matters because it shows where human beings fit within that structure and clarifies the path of ascent back to divine source. We are not accidents of material processes, but integral components of cosmic order, created with specific nature and destiny. We combine in ourselves all the levels of reality, from matter through soul and nous to participation in divinity itself. The cosmos is designed to make possible our existence and our eventual perfection. The planetary spheres are not obstacles but necessary stages in the soul's education. Matter is not evil, but the medium through which we learn through experience. Time is not meaningless succession, but the unfolding of purpose. By contemplating cosmic order, we come to recognize ourselves as microcosms and to understand that the same principles governing the universe govern our own transformation. The ancient injunction to know thyself means to recognize one's place in and identity with the cosmic whole. Self-knowledge is simultaneously cosmological knowledge and theological knowledge because the self, the cosmos, and God are ultimately one reality viewed from different perspectives. The Hermetic understanding of human nature begins with the striking assertion that we are essentially divine beings, temporarily inhabiting material form. We are not bodies that happen to have souls, but souls that temporarily wear bodies as garments. Our true identity lies in Nous, the divine intellect that we share with the Supreme God and that constitutes our innermost essence. This exalted anthropology, which grants humanity almost unimaginable dignity and potential, while also acknowledging our present degraded condition, shapes the entire Hermetic spiritual path. The fundamental human predicament, according to Hermetic teaching, is that we have forgotten our divine nature. We mistake ourselves for mortal animals driven by appetites and fears when we are actually immortal spiritual beings capable of knowing and uniting with God. This ignorance is not merely intellectual error, but an existential condition affecting our entire mode of being. We live in what the texts call a drunken sleep, stupefied by bodily existence and unable to perceive reality as it truly is. Awakening from this sleep through Gnosis, immediate experiential knowledge of divine truth, constitutes the goal of Hermetic practice. But achieving Gnosis requires understanding the soul's structure and origin, the nature of knowledge itself, the obstacles that prevent illumination, and the methods by which those obstacles can be overcome. The soul's descent into material embodiment follows a narrative established in the Poimandres and elaborated throughout the Hermetic corpus. Originally, the soul existed in the divine realm as pure mind, an undescended intelligence, contemplating eternal truth in unity with God. At some point, motivated by desire to know itself through experience of otherness, the soul begins to descend through the cosmic hierarchy. As it passes through each of the 7 planetary spheres on its way to earthly incarnation, the corresponding planetary archon impresses upon it certain faculties and limitations. From Saturn, the soul receives rationality, but also the tendency to falsehood. From Jupiter comes justice, but also ambition. Mars gives courage and anger. The Sun grants reason, but also pride. Venus bestows love and desire. Mercury provides eloquence and cunning. The Moon imparts the capacity for growth and decline. By the time the soul reaches Earth and unites with a material body composed of the 4 elements, it has accumulated a complex structure of powers and passions that both enable and constrain its earthly existence. The body itself is not intrinsically evil, but it becomes the source of false identification when the soul forgets its origin and mistakes bodily life for ultimate reality. The human condition, as the texts describe it, is thus fundamentally liminal and ambiguous. We stand at the intersection of the spiritual and material worlds, participating in both while belonging fully to neither. We possess nous that connects us directly to divine mind, yet we also have an animal body with its instinctual drives for survival and reproduction. We can contemplate eternal truths, yet we are subject to temporal processes of growth and decay. We contain within our composite nature all the cosmic levels from pure intellect to dense matter. This makes us microcosms, universes in miniature, reflecting in our small compass the entire structure of macrocosmic reality. The Hermetic texts frequently emphasize human uniqueness and dignity. We are the only creatures who combine divine and mortal natures. Angels and other spiritual beings are purely immortal. Animals are purely mortal. Only humans mediate between these realms. This gives us both tremendous creative power and grave responsibility. We can choose to identify upward with our divine nous or downward with our animal nature. We can ascend to divinity or descend into pure materiality. The choice is genuinely ours because we possess free will, the capacity to direct attention and identification consciously. Knowledge in the Hermetic system is not primarily discursive reasoning or accumulation of information, but direct insight into the nature of reality. Gnosis is experiential and transformative. It is not knowing about God, but knowing God directly through participatory union. The texts distinguish between different types of knowledge. Ordinary sense perception provides information about material appearances, but not about underlying reality. Discursive reasoning can infer truths through logical argument and can prepare the mind for higher knowledge. But ultimate gnosis transcends both sense and reason, emerging as direct intuitive apprehension when the soul turns inward and discovers its identity with divine nous. This knowledge is self-authenticating. One who has achieved gnosis knows with absolute certainty because the knower, the known, and the knowing become one. The texts compare this enlightenment to vision. Just as someone who sees light knows they see it and requires no proof, so one who experiences gnosis knows divine truth immediately and indubitably. This emphasis on direct experience over doctrine or authority would influence Christian mysticism, Jewish Kabbalah, Islamic Sufism, and later Western esotericism, wherever these traditions prioritized inner realization over external observance. The obstacles preventing gnosis are both cosmological and psychological. Cosmologically, the soul is trapped in matter and subject to fate or Haimamen, the deterministic causation flowing from planetary influences. The 7 planetary archons who mark the descending soul with their influences now dominate it through these same powers. Our moods, desires, and compulsions reflect planetary forces acting upon us. We are not free, but bound by necessity unless we can rise above the spheres that determine earthly existence. Liberation requires ascending through the planetary levels and surrendering the faculties they bestowed, returning to original divine simplicity. Psychologically, the obstacles are ignorance, false identification, and enslavement to bodily passions. We have forgotten who we truly are. We identify with the composite psychosomatic ego rather than with transcendent nous. We pursue pleasure and flee pain, seek wealth and fear poverty, crave reputation and dread obscurity, all of which entraps us more deeply in material existence. These passions are not intrinsically evil, but they become chains when mistaken for our true good. The path to gnosis involves both intellectual understanding and spiritual practice, both learning and unlearning. One must first encounter teaching that awakens the suspicion that ordinary consciousness does not perceive reality truly. The Hermetic texts themselves serve this function, proclaiming that we are divine and calling us to remember our origin. Hearing this message from a teacher or text initiates the process of awakening. But intellectual assent to the teaching is not itself gnosis. One must engage in practices that purify consciousness and prepare it to receive illumination. These practices include ethical discipline to free oneself from domination by passions, contemplative exercises to still the mind's restless activity, philosophical inquiry to understand cosmic structure and one's place within it, and what might be called devotional orientation toward the divine as supremely worthy of love and desire. The texts do not provide detailed meditation instructions or elaborate spiritual technologies. The emphasis falls rather on sustained intention to know God and willingness to release attachment to material concerns. Those who earnestly seek will find because God actively desires to be known and provides the means for our return. Several tractates describe the actual experience of gnosis in varying ways. In the Poimandres, Hermes receives direct vision from divine mind revealing the structure of reality and the path of liberation. The experience transforms his consciousness completely, giving him certain knowledge and commissioning him to teach others. In the Crater, those who baptize themselves in the bowl of mind filled by God are transformed, receiving nous and becoming perfect. In the key, Tat must learn to separate himself from bodily confusion and receive the divine word through interior silence. In the secret Sermon on the Mountain, Tat undergoes regeneration as divine powers replace the 12 material torments, and he becomes able to perceive reality with spiritual rather than bodily senses. Common to these accounts is the emphasis on transformation. Gnosis is not adding new information to existing consciousness, but becoming a different kind of being. The regenerate person is deified, made godlike, while still inhabiting mortal form. They achieve what the Christian tradition would call theosis, or divinization, becoming by grace what God is by nature. The content of Gnosis, what one knows when achieving enlightenment, includes several essential recognitions. First, one knows with certainty that God exists, and that divine being is the ground and source of all reality. This is not belief or inference, but immediate awareness of divine presence. Second, one knows the structure of reality, understanding how the cosmos emanates from divine source through levels of decreasing spirituality, and how all things remain connected through their origin. Third, one knows one's own true nature as divine knows temporarily clothed in soul and body. One recognizes that what one had taken as self, the bodily ego with its fears and desires, is not true identity. Fourth, one knows the path of ascent by which consciousness can return to unity with God. Fifth, one achieves freedom from fear of death, understanding that the death of the body is merely a change of garment for the immortal soul. These recognitions transform how one inhabits the world. Ordinary activities continue, but from a radically different center. The enlightened person has achieved apatheia, freedom from being dominated by passion and circumstance, because they no longer identify with the mortal composite, but with eternal spirit. The relationship between Gnosis and virtue deserves careful attention. Is Gnosis primarily intellectual insight that then motivates virtue, or is virtue the preparation that makes Gnosis possible? The texts suggest both. Ethical purification is necessary to achieve Gnosis because virtuous action frees the soul from domination by bodily passions and material attachments. One who remains enslaved to greed, lust, anger, and fear cannot achieve the interior stability and clarity required for contemplation. Virtue prepares the way, but Gnosis itself is the direct cause of virtuous living in a deeper sense. One who truly knows their divine nature and perceives reality correctly cannot act viciously even while inhabiting the material world. The soul that remembers its identity with God naturally acts according to divine nature. Vice stems from ignorance, from false identification, from taking appearances for reality. Knowledge dissolves these errors, and with them the motivation for vicious action. The regenerate person is not struggling against temptation, but has transcended the very conditions that generate temptation. This represents an intellectualist ethics reminiscent of Socrates' claim that no one errs willingly. If we truly knew what was good, we would do it. Our failures stem from defective understanding. The doctrine of the soul's immortality provides both motivation and consolation. The texts insist repeatedly that the soul is essentially immortal because it participates in divine nous, which is eternal. What dies is only the material body and the lower psychic functions attached to it. The rational soul that has achieved Gnosis ascends at death through the planetary spheres, progressively shedding the faculties acquired during descent. At each level it becomes simpler, purer, more unified until finally it enters the 8th sphere of fixed stars, possessing only its own essential power. From there it passes into the 9th sphere and achieves union with God, becoming itself a power in God. This is not absorption and loss of individual identity, but recognition of original identity. The text employs a striking simile. As many drops of water become one river, without losing their essence as water, so many souls become one with God without losing their essence as intelligence. For those who have not achieved Gnosis, the fate is less certain. Some texts suggest ignorant souls may undergo reincarnation, returning to bodily life to continue learning. Others hint at dissolution or at remaining trapped in the lower spheres. The enlightened soul, however, has secured liberation and immortality through knowledge. The emphasis on self-knowledge as the path to divine knowledge reflects a characteristic Hermetic move. The ancient injunction to know thyself is interpreted not as understanding one's personality traits or psychological patterns, though such understanding has value, but as recognizing one's essential nature as divine nous. The soul that truly knows itself knows God because the innermost self is identical with the divine mind that pervades all reality. This means the search for God is simultaneously the search for one's true identity. We need not seek God in some distant heaven or through exotic practices. God is always already present in the depths of consciousness, closer to us than we are to ourselves. The difficulty lies not in finding God, but in recognizing divine presence that was never absent. It is a matter of shifting attention from outward appearances to inward reality, from surface ego to transcendent self. The texts frequently employ the metaphor of light. Divine nous is like light illuminating consciousness. When attention turns outward toward material objects, we are like people who look at things illuminated by light but do not notice the light itself. When attention turns inward, we discover the source of illumination and recognize that the light by which we see all things is itself divine presence. The social and ethical implications of Gnosis deserve consideration. Does enlightenment lead to withdrawal from society or to continued engagement? The texts offer somewhat contradictory indications. On one hand, the regenerate person has transcended material concerns and bodily identification, suggesting a kind of detachment from worldly affairs. Several passages counsel separating oneself from those who remain trapped in ignorance, since their values and pursuits now appear as self-destructive folly. On the other hand, the enlightened person becomes a teacher, following Hermes' example by proclaiming the message of Gnosis to those capable of hearing it. Knowledge generates compassion and desire to help others awaken. The texts do not advocate monastic withdrawal or abandonment of social responsibility. Rather, they envision sages who live in the world but are not of it, who engage in ordinary activities from extraordinary consciousness. This anticipates later traditions of householder spirituality that reject the equation of spiritual attainment with renunciation. One can be married, have family, engage in work, participate in civic life, while maintaining inward realization of divine identity. The key is not external circumstance, but internal awareness. The democratic impulse in Hermetic soteriology, despite its sometimes elitist rhetoric, should not be overlooked. While the texts acknowledge that most people remain trapped in ignorance and that Gnosis is not for everyone, they also insist that every human being possesses the potential for enlightenment precisely because every human possesses divine nous. The capacity for knowledge is universally distributed even if actualization is rare. There is no chosen elect predestined for salvation, while others are predestined for damnation. The limiting factor is not divine favoritism or natural hierarchy, but individual willingness to undertake the difficult work of self-transformation. Anyone who earnestly seeks Gnosis and prepares themselves through ethical and intellectual discipline can achieve it. God actively desires to be known and provides the means for our return. The mystical elitism is practical rather than ontological. In practice, few pursue wisdom and fewer still achieve it. But in principle, the path is open to all. This universalism distinguishes Hermetic Gnosis from many ancient mystery religions with their exclusive initiations and secret rites accessible only to select members. The secret of Hermeticism is open secret, paradoxically both universally available and rarely attained. The persistence of Hermetic anthropology in later Western thought demonstrates the enduring power of these ideas about human nature and potential. The Renaissance cult of human dignity drew heavily on Hermetic sources. Pico della Mirandola's famous oration presents human beings as created without fixed nature, so that we might freely determine ourselves and become whatever we choose, even divine. This exaltation of human creative power and potential for self-transformation echoes Hermetic teaching. The romantic conception of the self as bearing divine spark, capable of infinite development, finding truth through inward contemplation rather than external authority, shows Hermetic influence filtered through multiple intermediaries. Transcendentalism's conviction that the individual soul can directly know God without priestly mediation reflects Hermetic Gnosis adapted to American context. Even contemporary New Age spirituality's emphasis on realizing one's divine nature, transcending ego, and awakening to cosmic consciousness represents popularized Hermeticism. Whether we evaluate these developments as legitimate extension of authentic insight or as distortion and dilution depends on our philosophical commitments. What remains clear is that the Hermetic vision of human beings as divine intelligences temporarily incarnate in matter continues to inspire and challenge those who encounter it. The 12 torments of matter, as enumerated in the Secret Sermon on the Mountain, provide the Hermetic catalogue of vices from which the soul must be liberated. These 12 are ignorance, grief, incontinence, desire, injustice, greed, deceit, envy, fraud, anger, recklessness, and malice. This list combines intellectual errors, emotional disturbances, and moral failings into a single composite picture of unregenerate consciousness. Ignorance stands first because it is the root from which other vices grow. One who does not know their true nature as divine inevitably identifies with the body and pursues bodily goods as ultimate values. This false identification generates the specific passions and vices that follow. Grief arises from attachment to things that pass away. If I identify with my body, I must grieve its inevitable decay. If I identify with possessions, I grieve their loss. If I identify with relationships, I grieve separation and death. Incontinence or lack of self-control follows from the attempt to satisfy insatiable bodily appetites. Desire in the sense of craving, of wanting what one does not have, reflects the soul's exile from its true home and desperate search for satisfaction in material things that cannot satisfy. Injustice, greed, deceit, envy, fraud, anger, recklessness, and malice all flow from the competitive pursuit of material goods experienced as scarce. When multiple bodies compete for limited resources, when ego seeks aggrandizement at others' expense, vice inevitably follows. The corresponding divine powers that replace these torments during regeneration are knowledge, joy, self-control, endurance, justice, generosity, truth, good, simplicity, life, light, and the good itself. These are not externally imposed commands, but the natural expression of consciousness that has awakened to reality. Knowledge replaces ignorance as the soul recognizes divine truth. Joy replaces grief as the soul discovers that its true identity is eternal and cannot be harmed by temporal changes. Self-control replaces incontinence as the soul no longer feels driven by bodily appetite, but freely directs itself according to divine reason. Endurance or patience replaces desire as the soul rests in present reality rather than reaching for what it lacks. Justice replaces injustice as the soul perceives the fundamental unity of all beings and cannot willfully harm what it knows to be itself. Generosity replaces greed as the soul recognizes abundance rather than scarcity. Truth replaces deceit as the soul has no reason to dissemble, possessing nothing to hide or defend. Simplicity replaces envy, fraud, and anger as the soul achieves unity and integration. Life, light, and goodness replace recklessness, malice, and all remaining vice as divine powers fully inhabit consciousness. The transformation described is radical and complete. The regenerate person is not a better version of their former self, but a fundamentally different kind of being. The path of purification by which this transformation is achieved involves both negative and positive dimensions, both abandoning what traps the soul and cultivating what liberates it. The negative aspect consists in detachment from material goods and bodily pleasures. This is not rejection of the material world as evil, but recognition that material things cannot provide the satisfaction we seek. The texts counsel moderation, using material goods as necessary for maintaining life, but refusing to identify with them or pursue them as ultimate values. Excessive attachment to wealth, reputation, pleasure, or power chains the soul to material existence and prevents ascent to divine consciousness. Detachment means using the world without being used by it, participating in embodied life without being defined by it. The positive aspect of purification consists in cultivating intellectual virtue through philosophical study, ethical virtue through practice of the moral excellences, and contemplative discipline through meditation and prayer. One studies the structure of reality to understand cosmic order and one's place within it. One practices justice, courage, moderation, and wisdom in daily life. One turns attention inward regularly to achieve interior silence and receptivity to divine illumination. These practices work together synergistically. Intellectual understanding motivates ethical action. Ethical action purifies consciousness and makes contemplation possible. Contemplation generates insight that deepens understanding. The doctrine of regeneration or rebirth represents the culmination of ethical and spiritual transformation. The Secret Sermon on the Mountain describes how Thoth, having prepared himself through study and discipline, receives from his father Hermes the gift of regeneration. This is not something Thoth achieves through his own effort, but something that happens to him when divine grace works upon prepared consciousness. The text emphasizes that regeneration cannot be taught in the ordinary sense. Hermes cannot make Thoth regenerate through instruction. He can only prepare Thoth to receive the transformation that God alone can grant. When the moment arrives, Thoth experiences the 12 torments of matter being driven out by divine powers entering his soul. He is born again, reconstituted with divine rather than material powers. The experience is described as becoming pregnant with God's word, giving birth to understanding, conceiving virtue, being filled with divine powers. The language is mystical and poetic rather than philosophical and systematic, pointing toward experiences that transcend ordinary language and concept. Yet certain features of the experience are clear. It is transformative rather than informative, participatory rather than objective, holistic rather than merely cognitive, and permanent rather than temporary. Once regenerated, one cannot return to ignorant consciousness. The relationship between regeneration and death deserves attention. In some sense, regeneration is death to the old self and birth of the new. The person who emerges from regeneration is not the same person who entered the process, though there is continuity of identity at the deepest level. The bodily ego with its fears and desires, its projects and concerns, has been displaced from the center of consciousness. It continues to exist but no longer dominates. The regenerate person experiences themselves primarily as divine nous that happens to be using a human body rather than as a human body that happens to have consciousness. This shift in identity is death of the false self and resurrection of the true self. Some texts describe physical death itself as the ultimate regeneration. When the enlightened soul separates from the body at death, the final liberation occurs. The soul ascends through the planetary spheres, surrendering the material accretions it acquired during descent, until it achieves naked simplicity and union with God. Physical death becomes not an enemy to be feared, but the consummation of the spiritual journey begun during embodied life. For one who has already undergone regeneration while living, physical death is simply the completion of what has already begun. The ethical implications of Hermetic metaphysics extend beyond individual transformation to cosmic participation. Because the universe is an organic whole, animated by divine soul and permeated by divine nous, human actions have cosmic significance. We are not isolated atoms acting upon each other through external forces, but organs of a single living body. What we do affects the whole, and the whole affects us through cosmic sympathy. This generates both ethical responsibility and metaphysical ground for ethics. We should act virtuously not just because it benefits us individually, or because divine commandment requires it, but because we participate in divine nature and virtuous action expresses our true identity. The enlightened person cannot willfully harm others because they recognize others as manifestations of the same divine mind they themselves are. The recognition of fundamental unity does not erase individual differences or justify moral indifference. Rather, it provides the deepest possible foundation for ethical concern. The other is not merely similar to me or related to me, but is ultimately the same self expressing itself through different manifestation. This metaphysical ethics resembles Vedantic teachings of non-dualism, in which enlightenment consists in recognizing one's identity with Brahman, the absolute reality underlying all appearances. The question of free will and determinism in Hermetic ethics is complex and perhaps ultimately paradoxical. On one hand, the texts affirm that we possess genuine choice. We can direct attention upward toward divine nous or downward toward bodily passions. We can choose to seek knowledge or remain in ignorance. The entire spiritual path assumes that human agency is real and significant. On the other hand, the texts acknowledge that most people are enslaved by fate or hymarmony, the deterministic causal sequences flowing from planetary influences and material necessity. We are swept along by forces we do not understand and cannot control. Furthermore, even the choice to seek Gnosis and the capacity to receive it ultimately depend on divine grace. God must grant illumination. We cannot seize it through our own power. The resolution of this apparent contradiction perhaps lies in recognizing different levels of freedom. At the ordinary level of unregenerate consciousness, we are indeed trapped by necessity, acted upon by cosmic forces and bodily drives that determine our thoughts and actions. But the very possibility of recognizing this bondage already indicates a level of consciousness that transcends it. In achieving Gnosis, we do not create freedom, but discover the freedom that is our essential nature. The enlightened person acts freely not by breaking natural law, but by identifying with the divine intelligence that is the source and ground of all law. The emphasis on Gnosis as the heart of the spiritual path might seem to undervalue moral action and practical virtue. If knowledge alone saves, why bother with ethical discipline? The texts address this concern by insisting that genuine Gnosis necessarily produces virtuous living. The knowledge that transforms is not mere intellectual assent to propositions, but participatory understanding that reconstitutes consciousness. You cannot truly know you are divine and continue acting viciously any more than you can truly know fire burns and deliberately burn yourself. The person who claims Gnosis while acting viciously thereby proves they have not achieved genuine knowledge, but only superficial understanding. At the same time, ethical discipline is essential preparation for Gnosis. The soul dominated by passions cannot achieve the clarity and stability required for contemplation. Vice clouds judgment and prevents accurate perception. Virtue purifies consciousness and creates conditions for illumination. So ethics and Gnosis are not opposed but mutually supporting. Ethics without Gnosis remains blind, following rules without understanding their ground. Gnosis without ethical preparation remains impossible, since unpurified consciousness cannot receive divine illumination. Only when both combine does transformation occur. The pedagogical method of Hermetic texts reflects their ethical concerns. The texts are not systematic treatises arguing from first principles to conclusions, but dialogues, visions, hymns, and revelatory discourses that engage the whole person. The teacher Hermes addresses his students Tat and Asclepius not by demonstrating logical proofs, but by awakening insight through suggestive questions, paradoxical statements, mythic narratives, and direct appeals to moral conscience. The goal is not to make the student accept certain doctrines intellectually, but to initiate transformation of consciousness. This pedagogical approach recognizes that ultimate truth cannot be communicated through concepts alone, but must be experienced directly. The texts function as means to that experience, pointing beyond themselves to reality they cannot fully articulate. This creates a characteristic tension in reading Hermetic texts. They simultaneously claim to reveal secret wisdom and acknowledge that the most important truth cannot be spoken. They teach while insisting that what matters most cannot be taught. They call for intellectual understanding while emphasizing experiential knowledge that transcends intellect. Navigating these tensions requires approaching the texts not as information to be extracted, but as spiritual exercises to be performed. The Hermetic understanding of community and spiritual friendship emerges from the relationship between Hermes and his students. Knowledge is transmitted through personal relationship, from teacher who has achieved Gnosis to student who seeks it. This requires mutual recognition and commitment. The teacher must discern which students are prepared to receive teaching and which would misuse it or fail to understand it. The student must trust the teacher and commit to the demanding work of self-transformation. The texts frequently warn against sharing wisdom with the unprepared, suggesting an esoteric dimension to Hermetic teaching. Yet they also insist that those who earnestly seek will find, that God desires to be known and provides teachers for sincere seekers. The apparent elitism is not about social status or ethnic identity, but about spiritual readiness. Anyone who cultivates virtue and seeks truth becomes capable of receiving Gnosis regardless of external circumstances. The community that emerges is thus a spiritual family bound by shared commitment to divine knowledge rather than a social institution defined by rules and hierarchy. Those who have achieved Gnosis recognize each other and can support each other's continued development while also serving as teachers for those still awakening. The ultimate goal of Hermetic ethics is described through various terms: Gnosis, regeneration, divinization, union with God, achievement of apatheia and ataraxia, liberation from fate, immortalization. These different formulations emphasize different aspects of the same reality. In achieving this goal, the soul does not lose its individual identity, but realizes its true identity. We become fully ourselves by becoming divine. This paradox reflects the teaching that our deepest self is not the empirical ego, but nous, divine intelligence that was always already our true nature, even when we identified with body and passions. The ethical life consists in progressively aligning empirical existence with essential reality, allowing divine nature to express itself through human personality without distortion. The sage embodies divine virtues of wisdom, goodness, justice, and beauty, while remaining fully human. This represents not superhuman achievement, but rather fully realized humanity. We are created to be divine, designed for union with God. The spiritual path is coming home to what we always were, remembering what we had forgotten, recognizing what had always been present but unnoticed. Ethics in the Hermetic vision is ultimately the art of living in accordance with divine nature, expressing through finite mortal form the infinite eternal reality that is our source, substance, and destiny. During the first 4 centuries of the Common Era, Hermeticism flourished as part of the rich and complex intellectual landscape of late antiquity. This was a period of remarkable religious and philosophical creativity, during which traditional paganism, Neoplatonic philosophy, various Gnostic movements, Judaism in its Hellenistic and rabbinic forms, and Christianity in its formative stages all competed and interacted. Hermetic thought participated fully in this cultural conversation, borrowing from, contributing to, and competing with these other traditions. Understanding Hermeticism in its original context requires examining its relationships with the major philosophical and religious movements of the time. How did Hermeticism relate to Neoplatonism, the dominant philosophical school that synthesized Platonic, Aristotelian, and Stoic ideas into comprehensive metaphysical systems? What connections and differences existed between Hermetic Gnosis and Gnostic movements that also promised salvation through esoteric knowledge? How did Christian thinkers respond to Hermetic texts, and did Hermeticism influence Christian theology? What role did Hermetic ideas play in the development of Islamic philosophy during and after the translation movement? These questions reveal Hermeticism not as an isolated tradition, but as an active participant in late antique debates about God, cosmos, and human destiny. The relationship between Hermeticism and Neoplatonism requires particular attention given their shared conceptual vocabulary and metaphysical framework. Neoplatonism emerged as a systematic school of philosophy in the 3rd century with Plotinus, though its roots stretch back through Middle Platonism to Plato himself. Plotinus taught that all reality emanates from the absolute one through successive levels. First the intellect or nous containing the eternal forms, then soul which animates the cosmos, then the material world. Human beings possess rational souls that can, through philosophical discipline and contemplation, ascend back through these levels to achieve mystical union with the One. This basic scheme closely resembles Hermetic cosmology and soteriology. Both traditions employ the language of emanation. Both posit a hierarchy of being from pure spirit to dense matter. Both emphasize divine mind or nous as creative principle. Both teach that the human soul can achieve union with the divine through knowledge and purification. The similarities are striking enough that some scholars have argued for direct influence in one direction or the other, or for both drawing on common sources in Middle Platonic philosophy. Yet important differences distinguish Hermetic from Neoplatonic thought. Plotinus developed a rigorously systematic metaphysics with precise technical terminology and sustained logical argument. His Enneads read as sophisticated philosophy, deploying abstract reasoning to address metaphysical problems. The Hermetic texts, by contrast, employ mythic narrative, visionary revelation, and poetic language alongside philosophical argument. They appeal to religious experience and mystical insight rather than purely rational demonstration. Plotinus emphasizes the absolute transcendence and ineffability of the One, which is beyond being, thought, or any positive description. Hermetic texts, while acknowledging divine transcendence, also describe God in more personal terms as Father who cares for creation and actively desires human salvation. Plotinus's One does not create through deliberate choice or concern for creatures, but overflows naturally through necessity of its own perfection. The Hermetic God seems more providential and personally engaged with the cosmos. Plotinus treats matter as near absolute privation, the lowest point of emanation where divine light barely penetrates. Hermetic texts generally adopt a more positive view of matter as necessary medium for divine self-expression. Iamblichus, the 4th century Neoplatonist who developed the Theurgic philosophy, shows clearer Hermetic influence. Iamblichus argued that philosophical contemplation alone cannot achieve union with the divine. Human beings need the gods' active aid through the urgical ritual, sacred ceremonies that invoke divine powers to elevate the soul. This emphasis on ritual practice and divine assistance rather than purely intellectual effort resembles Hermetic teaching about regeneration as a gift of God's grace. Iamblichus explicitly cited Hermetic texts as authorities for his theurgic philosophy and incorporated Hermetic teachings about the sympathy linking all levels of reality. His defense of traditional religion and its statues, oracles, and sacred rites echoed the Hermetic Asclepius with its celebration of Egyptian temple practices, including animation of divine statues. For Iamblichus, the Hermetic texts represented ancient Egyptian wisdom that preserved truths Plato himself had learned from Egyptian priests. This view of Hermeticism as ancient theology, running parallel to Greek philosophy, would dominate the tradition's reception through the Renaissance. The relationship between Hermeticism and Gnosticism is complex and has generated extensive scholarly debate. Gnosticism was not a single movement, but a diverse collection of religious groups sharing certain family resemblances. Radical dualism dividing spirit from matter. Identification of the material world's creator as an ignorant or malevolent demiurge, distinct from the supreme transcendent God. Emphasis on gnosis or esoteric knowledge as the means of salvation. Mythological narratives about the soul's fall into matter and its potential redemption. Organization into initiatic communities with secret teachings reserved for advanced students. Many of these features appear in Hermetic texts, leading some scholars to classify Hermeticism as a species of Gnosticism. The Corpus Hermeticum certainly teaches that the soul has descended into matter and must ascend back to divine unity through gnosis. It employs mythological narratives about cosmogonic events. It treats knowledge as salvific and presents teachings as revealed mysteries. The Poimandres creation myth shares structural similarities with Gnostic texts from Nag Hammadi. However, crucial differences distinguish Hermeticism from typical Gnostic movements. Most significantly, Hermetic texts do not exhibit the radical dualism characteristic of Gnosticism. The material world is not evil or the product of an ignorant demiurge, but a good creation expressing divine wisdom. The body is not a prison from which the soul must escape, but a temporary vehicle the soul inhabits. Matter is not inherently corrupt, but merely the lowest level of divine emanation. The God who creates the world in Hermetic texts is good, wise, and identical with or directly connected to the supreme transcendent God. There is no fallen creator deity making a defective world. The Hermetic texts celebrate the beauty and order of the cosmos as evidence of divine intelligence, while Gnostic texts typically portray the cosmos as a trap constructed by ignorant or malevolent forces to imprison souls. Furthermore, Hermetic texts show concern for cosmology and natural philosophy, seeking to understand the material world's structure and operation, while Gnostic texts generally dismiss such concerns as irrelevant or even dangerous distractions from spiritual liberation. The term optimistic Gnosticism has sometimes been applied to Hermeticism to capture its unique position. Like Gnosticism, it teaches salvation through gnosis and describes the soul's descent into and ascent from material embodiment. Unlike Gnosticism, it affirms the goodness of creation and the legitimate authority of the world-creating deity. This makes Hermeticism compatible with philosophical traditions like Platonism that seek to understand and celebrate the natural world as a manifestation of divine reason. It also made Hermeticism more acceptable to Christians, who insisted on divine creation's goodness and rejected Gnostic dualism as heresy. The precise boundaries between Hermeticism, Gnosticism, and Neoplatonism remain fuzzy and debated. These were not sharply defined systems with clear membership criteria, but fluid traditions sharing ideas and practitioners. Individual teachers and texts combined elements from multiple sources. A given person might study both Hermetic texts and Gnostic scriptures, practice Neoplatonic philosophy, and identify as Christian. The religious and philosophical landscape of late antiquity was remarkably syncretistic and permeable. Christian responses to Hermeticism varied from enthusiastic acceptance to suspicious rejection, depending on which texts and teachings were emphasized. Early Christian apologists like Lactantius in the 4th century cited Hermetic texts approvingly as evidence that even pagan philosophers had glimpsed truths about the one God and divine providence. Lactantius quoted extensively from the Asclepius to demonstrate that Hermes Trismegistus, this most ancient of sages, had taught monotheism, divine creation, and moral providence long before Christ. If the oldest Gentile wisdom confirmed Christian teaching, this validated Christianity's claim to universal truth, accessible through both revelation and reason. Clement of Alexandria and other Christian Platonists who sought to synthesize Greek philosophy with Christian theology found Hermetic texts useful as bridges between pagan and Christian thought. The doctrine of the Logos as divine creative word resonated with Christian Christology. The emphasis on Gnosis could be Christianized by identifying it with knowledge of Christ. The vision of human dignity and potential for divinization fit Christian teaching about humans created in God's image and called to become partakers of divine nature. However, other Christian thinkers viewed Hermeticism more suspiciously. Augustine, the most influential Latin Church father, acknowledged that Hermetic texts contained some truth, but condemned their account of statue animation and astrology as demonic magic. The Asclepius described how Egyptian priests drew divine powers into statues, essentially creating gods through magical art. To Augustine, this represented pagan idolatry at its worst, making gods rather than worshipping the true God. He argued that any spiritual powers manifesting through such practices were demons deceiving humans rather than legitimate divine presences. Augustine's influential critique established a pattern that would persist. Christians could acknowledge Hermetic philosophy's genuine insights while rejecting Hermetic theurgy and magic as impermissible. This distinction between philosophical Hermetica, which taught theology and cosmology acceptable to Christian readers, and technical Hermetica, which provided instructions for magical operations condemned by the Church, would shape medieval and Renaissance reception of the tradition. The question of whether Hermeticism influenced early Christian theology remains contested. Some scholars argue for direct influence, pointing to similarities between Hermetic and Johannine theology, both emphasizing the divine logos, or word, as creative principle and light of consciousness. Others suggest both drew independently on common Middle Platonic sources. The Hermetic doctrine that humans are created in God's image and called to become divine through knowledge resembles Christian teaching about the imago Dei and theosis. Hermetic soteriology, which emphasizes rebirth through reception of divine spirit, resonates with Christian baptismal theology and Pauline language of being born again. The Hermetic vision of redemption through Gnosis, granted as gift of grace, shares structure with Christian salvation through faith in Christ. These similarities could indicate Hermetic influence on Christianity, Christian influence on later Hermetic texts, both traditions drawing on shared cultural resources or structural similarities arising inevitably from similar theological concerns. Determining direct influence proves difficult given sparse evidence and complex transmission histories. What we can say with certainty is that Hermeticism and Christianity were neighbouring traditions in the same cultural space, known to each other and engaged in conversation if not always agreement. The transmission of Hermetic texts and ideas into Islamic civilization deserves recognition as one of the most consequential developments in the tradition's history. Beginning in the 8th century, the Abbasid Caliphate's translation movement rendered Greek philosophical, scientific, and esoteric texts into Arabic. Hermetic texts were among those translated and studied by Muslim scholars. The Emerald Tablet first appears in Arabic sources from this period, whether originally composed in Arabic or translated from a lost Greek text. Hermetic teachings on astrology, alchemy, magic, and natural philosophy found eager audience among Islamic scholars seeking to master the ancient sciences. The technical Hermetica particularly influenced Islamic alchemy and astrology. Jabir ibn Hayyan, the 8th century alchemist whose Latinized name Geber became legendary in medieval Europe, drew on Hermetic sources in developing his alchemical theory. The Sabians of Harran, a community that practiced star worship and preserved Greek learning, were sometimes identified as followers of Hermes, though the accuracy of this identification remains uncertain. Islamic philosophers engaged seriously with Hermetic ideas, even as they adapted them to Islamic theological commitments. Al-Kindi, the 9th century philosopher sometimes called the first Arab philosopher, cited Hermetic texts in developing his synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy and Islamic theology. Al-Razi, the great physician and philosopher, drew on Hermetic sources for his alchemy and natural philosophy. The Persian philosopher Suhrawardi in the 12th century constructed an illuminationist philosophy that integrated Hermetic themes with Islamic mysticism and Platonic metaphysics. The medieval Islamic magical text Picatrix, which would later be translated into Latin and influence Renaissance magic, contains extensive Hermetic material on celestial magic and talismans. Through these Islamic intermediaries, Hermetic ideas entered medieval European thought, shaping the development of alchemy, astrology, and natural magic that would flourish in the Latin West. The decline of paganism and traditional religion in late antiquity following Christianity's triumph might seem to spell the end of Hermeticism as living tradition. Pagan temples were closed, traditional rituals forbidden, ancient priesthoods dissolved. Yet Hermetic texts survived precisely because they could be read as philosophy rather than religion, as universal wisdom rather than pagan cult. Their emphasis on monotheism, immaterial God, and rational theology made them compatible with the three Abrahamic religions. Christians, Jews, and Muslims could all find value in Hermetic teaching when properly interpreted. The philosophical Hermetica survived in Greek manuscripts in Byzantium and in Arabic translation in the Islamic world. The technical Hermetica continued to be copied and studied by those pursuing alchemical and astrological knowledge. Hermeticism went underground in a sense, persisting not as public religion, but as esoteric tradition studied by philosophers and practitioners of the ancient sciences. This position at the margins of acceptable knowledge, neither fully orthodox nor entirely condemned, would characterize Hermeticism through the medieval period and shape its dramatic Renaissance revival. The question of practice versus theory in late antique Hermeticism deserves attention. To what extent was Hermeticism an armchair philosophy versus a lived spiritual practice? The philosophical texts emphasize contemplation, gnosis, moral purification, and regeneration as actual experiences to be sought, not just doctrines to be believed. The technical texts provide detailed instructions for astrological calculations, alchemical operations, creation of talismans, and ritual invocations. This suggests real communities of practitioners who studied these texts and attempted to apply their teachings. Yet we have little direct evidence about actual Hermetic communities, their organization, practices, or social composition. Were there Hermetic temples, priests, rituals comparable to the Mithraic mysteries or Isis cult? Or was Hermeticism primarily a textual tradition, with individuals reading and discussing texts without formal institutional structure? The evidence permits various interpretations. What seems clear is that Hermeticism existed as something more than purely theoretical philosophy, but something less than fully organized religion, with clergy, temples, and official doctrines. It occupied a middle space as spiritual philosophy or philosophical spirituality, offering both intellectual framework and practical path without requiring institutional affiliation or orthodox belief. The recovery and translation of Hermetic texts during the Italian Renaissance created what historian Francis Yates called the Hermetic tradition, a cultural movement that profoundly influenced Renaissance thought and contributed to the birth of modern science, despite being based on historical error. In 1463, when Cosimo de' Medici's agent, Leonardo of Pistoia, brought a Greek manuscript of the Corpus Hermeticum to Florence, European scholars possessed only scattered references to Hermes Trismegistus and Latin translations of a few works, including the Asclepius and Emerald Tablet. The arrival of the complete corpus prompted Cosimo to interrupt Marsilio Ficino's work, translating Plato's dialogues, and instead prioritize the Hermetic texts, which Cosimo wanted to read before he died. This interruption itself reveals the immense prestige Hermes commanded. Renaissance humanists believed they were recovering the most ancient wisdom, revelation granted to humanity in remotest Egyptian antiquity, before Moses and the Hebrew prophets, before Pythagoras and Plato. The texts seem to confirm Christian truth through independent ancient testimony, while also promising access to powerful spiritual and natural knowledge. The result was an intellectual transformation that shaped philosophy, magic, art, science, and religion for over a century, until Isaac Casaubon's philological demonstration in 1614 exposed the text's late antique composition. Marsilio Ficino's Latin translation of the Corpus Hermeticum, completed in 1463 and printed in 1471, made the texts widely accessible to European scholars who could not read Greek. Ficino's enthusiasm for Hermetic philosophy shaped his own enormously influential Neoplatonic synthesis. He saw Hermes as the fountainhead of an ancient theological tradition, the Prisca Theologia, that had been granted to humanity in its earliest ages, and from which all later philosophy derived. This chain of ancient wisdom ran from Hermes through Zoroaster, Orpheus, Pythagoras, and Plato to reach fulfillment in Christianity. Ficino argued that these ancient sages had been inspired by God to preserve truths that would prepare humanity for Christ's coming. The Hermetic texts particularly impressed Ficino because they seemed to describe the Trinity, divine creation, and the Incarnation, core Christian doctrines apparently known to pre-Christian Egyptian wisdom. In reality, as modern scholarship recognizes, the Hermetic texts were composed in the Christian era and likely absorbed Christian ideas, but Renaissance readers naturally interpreted the apparent parallels as prophecy or independent confirmation. Ficino's Hermetic Christianity integrated Hermetic cosmology and spiritual practices with Christian theology and worship. His treatise on obtaining life from the heavens described how to use natural magic grounded in cosmic correspondences to draw down beneficial celestial influences for health and vitality. This spiritus magic worked through natural sympathies between earthly substances and celestial powers. By using herbs, stones, music, colours and images corresponding to Jupiter or Venus or the Sun, one could attract those planetary influences and benefit from them. Ficino carefully distinguished this natural magic, which operated through created correspondences God had built into nature, from demonic magic that invoked fallen angels. By grounding his practice in Hermetic and Neoplatonic philosophy of cosmic sympathy, he could present it as legitimate natural philosophy rather than forbidden sorcery. Nonetheless, his magical practices existed in theological grey area, criticised by some church authorities and defended by others depending on how one interpreted natural causation and demonic intervention. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, Ficino's brilliant younger contemporary, pushed Renaissance Hermeticism in even more ambitious directions. Pico's famous Oration on the Dignity of Man, written in 1486 as preface to his proposed public disputation on 900 Theses, synthesized Hermeticism with Platonism, Aristotelianism, Kabbalah, and Christian theology. The oration drew heavily on Hermetic anthropology in describing human beings as created without fixed nature, so that we might freely determine ourselves and become whatever we choose. God placed us at the world's centre and said, "We have made you neither celestial nor earthly, neither mortal nor immortal, so that with freedom of choice and with honour you may fashion yourself in whatever shape you shall prefer." This vision of human creative power and potential for self-transformation echoed Hermetic teaching that humans are microcosms containing all cosmic levels and capable of ascending to divinity through knowledge and virtue. Pico's synthesis attempted to demonstrate that beneath apparent diversity among philosophical and religious traditions lay fundamental unity, all pointing toward the same truths that Christianity most perfectly articulated. Pico also championed Kabbalah, Jewish mystical and magical tradition, as part of Prisca Theologia. He argued that Moses had received secret oral teachings alongside the written Torah, preserved through Kabbalah and containing profound mysteries. Pico claimed Kabbalah confirmed Christian doctrines including the Trinity and Incarnation when properly interpreted. By linking Kabbalah with Hermeticism as parallel streams of ancient wisdom, Pico vastly expanded the Renaissance conception of perennial philosophy. Both traditions dealt with names of God, cosmic correspondences, creation through divine emanation, and human potential for spiritual ascent. The combination of Hermeticism and Kabbalah would deeply influence Renaissance magic and later Western esotericism. Practitioners developed elaborate systems of correspondences linking Hebrew letters, divine names, planets, angels, elements, and physical substances. These systems enabled both speculative cosmology and operative magic, both understanding reality's structure and manipulating it through knowledge of secret connections. Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy, first circulated in manuscript around 1510 and published in 1533, provided the most comprehensive Renaissance synthesis of Hermetic magic. Agrippa systematically presented natural magic operating through earthly correspondences, celestial magic working with astrological influences, and ceremonial magic involving angelic and demonic spirits. He drew heavily on Hermetic and Neoplatonic philosophy to explain how magic operates through cosmic sympathy and correspondences. The elaborate tables in Agrippa's work catalogue relationships among planets, elements, metals, stones, plants, animals, body parts, diseases, virtues, vices, colours, sounds, angels, demons, and divine names. This encyclopedic mapping of correspondences created practical resources for magical operations, while also presenting a comprehensive vision of reality as interconnected system where everything relates to everything else through chains of sympathy. Agrippa's work represented the culmination of Renaissance Hermetic magic, but also contributed to its eventual decline. The sheer complexity and dubious practical results made the whole enterprise increasingly suspect to empirical-minded observers. Giordano Bruno stands as perhaps the most radical and tragic figure in Renaissance Hermeticism. This Dominican friar turned wandering philosopher absorbed Hermetic teachings so deeply that he came to believe the ancient Egyptian religion Hermes supposedly represented was superior to Christianity. Bruno accepted the Prisca Theologia framework but reversed its valuation. Rather than seeing Christianity as fulfillment of ancient wisdom, he viewed Christianity as corruption of pristine Egyptian natural religion. Bruno's cosmic philosophy, influenced by Copernican heliocentrism but extending far beyond Copernicus, envisioned an infinite universe containing innumerable worlds orbiting innumerable suns. Each world was alive and ensouled. God was immanent in all things as world soul rather than transcendent creator separate from creation. This pantheistic reading of Hermeticism, combined with Bruno's explicit rejection of Christian doctrine, led to his arrest by the Roman Inquisition. After 7 years of imprisonment and trial, Bruno was burned at the stake as heretic in Rome in 1600. His execution marked a turning point in Hermeticism's fortunes, demonstrating that aggressive promotion of Hermetic philosophy against Christianity could prove fatal. The role of Hermeticism in the scientific revolution remains debated among historians. Francis Yates argued influentially that Renaissance Hermetic magic, with its emphasis on understanding and manipulating nature through knowledge of hidden causes, helped create the active, interventionist attitude toward nature that characterized modern experimental science. The Hermetic practitioner did not simply contemplate nature from distance, but actively engaged with it, performing experiments in the laboratory, manipulating materials, testing correspondences. This practical orientation and confidence that nature could be understood and controlled helped motivate the empirical investigation of natural phenomena. Furthermore, the Hermetic conviction that mathematics provided key to cosmic structure anticipated the mathematization of physics. The belief that the cosmos was rationally ordered according to intelligible principles encouraged systematic investigation. Various scientific pioneers, including Copernicus, Kepler, and Newton, were influenced by Hermetic ideas even as they developed methods that would ultimately supersede Hermetic philosophy. The critique of Yates's thesis notes that correlating Hermeticism with science risks attributing causal connection to mere temporal coincidence. Many factors contributed to the scientific revolution, including improved instruments, mathematical techniques, institutional support, and intellectual networks. Hermeticism may have been one influence among many rather than the decisive factor. Furthermore, core Hermetic commitments like cosmic sympathy, astrological causation, and qualitative correspondences actually opposed the mechanical philosophy and quantitative methods that defined mature modern science. Newton abandoned his deep engagement with alchemy not because alchemy succeeded, but because it failed to yield the precise mathematical laws he sought. The relationship between Hermeticism and science thus appears complex. Hermetic philosophy may have helped motivate scientific inquiry, while Hermetic methods and explanatory frameworks were abandoned as science developed its own approaches. The fact remains that during the 16th and early 17th centuries, many thinkers combined interests in Hermetic philosophy, natural magic, alchemy, and what we would call legitimate science without experiencing these as contradictory. Isaac Casaubon's devastating philological analysis of the Corpus Hermeticum, published in 1614, destroyed the historical foundation of Renaissance Hermeticism. Casaubon demonstrated through careful examination of the text's Greek vocabulary, philosophical concepts, and theological terminology that they could not have been written in remotest antiquity. The language was late Koine Greek. The philosophical ideas derived from Platonism and Stoicism, as these had developed in the early Common Era. The theological concepts showed familiarity with Christianity. The texts were clearly products of Hellenistic Egypt in the first 3 centuries CE, not pristine revelations from before Moses and Plato. This revelation undermined Hermeticism's authority as independent confirmation of Christian truth and source of primordial wisdom. If the texts were late rather than early, they lost their special status as ancient theology running parallel to and confirming revelation. They became instead mere examples of religious syncretism and late antique mysticism, interesting historically perhaps, but without philosophical or theological authority. The consequences of Casaubon's exposure were profound and permanent. Scholarly interest in Hermetic texts declined dramatically. The Prisca Theologia, framework that had organized Renaissance understanding of philosophical tradition, collapsed. No longer could scholars trace an unbroken chain of ancient wisdom from Hermes through Plato to Christianity. The entire Renaissance project of synthesizing ancient philosophy with Christian revelation through Hermetic mediation became suspect. Natural magic and alchemy, which had drawn their theoretical justification from Hermetic philosophy of correspondences and cosmic sympathy, lost intellectual respectability. The mechanical philosophy developed by Descartes, Hobbes, and others explained natural phenomena through matter and motion without invoking occult qualities or sympathetic correspondences. Experimental science adopted quantitative methods and mechanical models rather than Hermetic principles. By the mid-17th century, Hermeticism had been relegated to the margins of intellectual life, dismissed as mystical confusion or charlatanry by mainstream philosophers and scientists who identified with the Enlightenment project of rational inquiry and empirical investigation. Yet Hermeticism did not disappear entirely. It persisted in esoteric traditions that valued the texts for spiritual and practical rather than historical reasons. Rosicrucian manifestos appearing in Germany in the early 17th century, before Casaubon's work was widely known, synthesized Hermetic alchemy with Christian mysticism and called for reformation of both religion and natural philosophy. Whether the Rosicrucian Brotherhood actually existed or was literary fiction remains debated, but the manifestos influenced numerous esoteric movements. Freemasonry, emerging as fraternal organization in the 17th and 18th centuries, incorporated Hermetic and alchemical symbolism into its rituals and teachings. The Egyptian rite developed by Cagliostro explicitly claimed Hermetic lineage. These esoteric fraternities preserved Hermetic philosophy and transmitted it to later generations, adapting ancient teachings to early modern concerns. Hermeticism found refuge among alchemists, astrologers, and spiritual seekers who continued to value the tradition's wisdom regardless of its historical accuracy. The underground life of Hermeticism in early modern esotericism ensured that the tradition would re-emerge powerfully in the 19th and 20th centuries, when Romanticism and occult revival created renewed interest in alternative spiritualities. The legacy of Renaissance Hermeticism extends beyond the specific doctrines that were accepted or rejected. The movement represented a bold attempt to integrate diverse traditions into comprehensive synthesis, to find unity beneath apparent diversity, to recover lost wisdom and apply it to contemporary concerns. This synthetic approach characterized much Renaissance thought, whether in Ficino's Platonic Christianity, Pico's 900 Theses, attempting to reconcile all philosophical schools, or Bruno's cosmic philosophy uniting Hermeticism with Copernicanism. The confidence that ancient wisdom contained truths modern learning had forgotten motivated serious scholarship and creative philosophy, even when specific historical claims proved false. The Renaissance recovery of ancient texts, including not just Hermetic writings, but Greek mathematics, philosophy, drama, and poetry, transformed European intellectual culture. The fact that Renaissance scholars sometimes misdated or misunderstood these texts does not negate the genuine advances in learning their recovery enabled. Hermeticism participated in this larger movement of cultural renewal, even as it also represented the persistence of magical thinking that modern science would eventually discredit. The legacy of Hermeticism in Western thought extends far beyond the boundaries of formal philosophy and science to influence art, literature, psychology, spirituality, and popular culture across 5 centuries. While the Hermetic texts lost intellectual authority after Casaubon's exposure of their late antique composition, the ideas they articulated continued to circulate through various channels. Some Hermetic concepts were absorbed into mainstream philosophy and science, detached from their original context and rationalized according to new frameworks. Other Hermetic teachings persisted in esoteric traditions that valued spiritual wisdom over historical accuracy. Still others were rediscovered, reinterpreted, and adapted to address contemporary concerns in ways their ancient authors could not have imagined. Understanding Hermeticism's modern legacy requires tracing multiple lines of influence through occult revival movements, Romantic nature philosophy, depth psychology, New Age spirituality, and contemporary interest in alternative worldviews. It also requires recognizing that much of what passes today for Hermeticism has been substantially transformed, sometimes beyond recognition, from the ancient and Renaissance sources. The 18th century Enlightenment appeared hostile to Hermeticism and everything it represented. Enlightenment thinkers championed reason over revelation, empirical investigation over ancient authority, mechanical explanation over occult qualities, progress over tradition. From this perspective, Hermeticism embodied exactly the kind of superstition and mysticism that humanity needed to transcend. Voltaire mocked alchemists and astrologers. Encyclopedia compilers classified magic and occult philosophy as obsolete errors. The confidence that human reason armed with scientific method could comprehend nature and improve society made appeals to ancient wisdom seem unnecessary if not reactionary. Yet even during this period of rationalist triumph, Hermeticism found defenders and new expressions. Freemasonry, which emerged as major fraternal organization in this period, incorporated Hermetic and alchemical symbolism extensively despite its Enlightenment commitment to rational religion and social progress. The rituals and teachings of various Masonic rites drew on Hermetic cosmology, the principle of correspondence, alchemy as spiritual transformation, and the vision of initiates ascending through grades of knowledge toward illumination. Freemasonry thus preserved Hermetic ideas in ritual and symbolic form, even as philosophical discourse abandoned them. The Romantic reaction against Enlightenment rationalism created renewed interest in tradition, imagination, mysticism, and alternative ways of knowing that privileged Hermetic themes. Romantic poets and philosophers rejected mechanical nature for organic unity, mathematical physics for qualitative experience, scientific materialism for spiritual reality. They found inspiration in traditions the Enlightenment had dismissed, including alchemy, astrology, Kabbalah, and Hermeticism. The Romantic conviction that nature is alive, that matter and spirit form continuum, that imaginative vision perceives truths inaccessible to empirical science, echoed fundamental Hermetic principles. William Blake's prophetic poetry drew on Hermetic cosmology and alchemical symbolism. Goethe's Faust engaged seriously with magic and alchemy as paths to knowledge. Coleridge studied Neoplatonism and Hermeticism extensively. The German nature philosophy developed by Schelling and others attempted to understand nature as self-organizing living system, animated by spirit rather than mechanical aggregate of dead matter. This philosophical approach resonated with Hermetic cosmic vitalism even when it did not cite Hermetic texts directly. The 19th century occult revival brought Hermetic philosophy back into public discourse through various esoteric organizations and teachers. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, founded in England in 1888, created an elaborate initiatic system synthesizing Hermeticism with Kabbalah, tarot, astrology, and ceremonial magic. Members studied Hermetic texts, performed rituals based on Hermetic cosmology, practiced techniques for developing spiritual faculties, and worked toward the magician's ultimate goal of conversation with one's holy guardian angel or higher self. While Golden Dawn's ceremonial complexity went far beyond anything in ancient Hermetic texts, the core philosophy of cosmic correspondences, human microcosm, and spiritual ascent through knowledge derived from the Hermetic tradition. Famous members including Yeats, Crowley, and Dion Fortune disseminated Hermetic ideas through poetry, magical writings, and occult teaching. The order's influence on 20th century Western esotericism was substantial, even though it fractured into competing groups after internal conflicts. Theosophy, the esoteric movement founded by Helena Blavatsky in 1875, presented itself as recovery of ancient wisdom tradition underlying all religions. Blavatsky's massive work, The Secret Doctrine, synthesized elements from Hinduism, Buddhism, Hermeticism, Kabbalah, and Gnosticism into comprehensive occult cosmology and anthropology. While Theosophy drew more heavily on Eastern sources than traditional Hermeticism, it shared the fundamental Hermetic commitment to esoteric knowledge, transcending exoteric religion, spiritual evolution through successive lives, cosmic correspondence between macrocosm and microcosm, and ancient wisdom preserved through initiatic transmission. The Theosophical Society's emphasis on comparative religion and universal brotherhood attracted educated seekers dissatisfied with both materialistic science and dogmatic religion. It influenced numerous 20th century spiritual movements and helped prepare Western audiences for Eastern teachings. The 20th century witnessed both academic recovery of Hermeticism as historical tradition worthy of serious scholarly study and popular appropriation of Hermetic ideas in New Age spirituality. On the scholarly side, researchers like Walter Scott, Arthur Darby Nock, and André Jean Festugiere produced critical editions and translations of Hermetic texts, along with historical and philosophical analysis. These scholars established that Hermeticism represented significant current in late antique thought, neither primitive superstition nor profound primordial revelation, but sophisticated Hellenistic philosophy deserving study on its own terms. Francis Yates's work on Renaissance Hermeticism, particularly Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic tradition published in 1964, demonstrated that understanding the Hermetic tradition was essential for grasping Renaissance intellectual history and the origins of modern science. Subsequent scholarship has refined and in some cases challenged Yates's interpretations, while confirming that Hermeticism significantly influenced Western thought. Carl Jung's depth psychology represents one of the most philosophically sophisticated modern appropriations of Hermetic ideas. Jung became fascinated with alchemy in the 1920s and spent decades studying alchemical texts and images, seeing in them symbolic representations of individuation, the psychological process by which unconscious contents become integrated into consciousness. For Jung, the alchemical transformation of base metal into gold paralleled psychological transformation of the unconscious personality into the integrated self. Alchemical imagery of conjunction, dissolution, coagulation, and rebirth describe stages of psychological development. The Hermetic principle of correspondence, manifested in Jung's concept of synchronicity, meaningful coincidences linking psyche and world through a causal connecting principle. Jung's work validated Hermetic symbolism as psychologically profound even after its cosmological claims had been scientifically superseded. He showed that traditions like Hermeticism address perennial features of human psychology and spiritual development regardless of their literal truth or historical accuracy. The New Age movement that emerged in the late 20th century drew extensively, if often imprecisely, on Hermetic ideas. The Kybalions' 7 Hermetic Principles became foundational texts for New Age metaphysics despite their dubious historical status. New Thought's emphasis on mind power and positive thinking adapted the Hermetic principle of mentalism. The vision of humans as divine beings who have forgotten their true nature and can reclaim spiritual power through knowledge pervades New Age spirituality. The principle, as above, so below, is invoked to support claims about consciousness creating reality, thoughts manifesting material circumstances, and microcosmic human experience, reflecting macrocosmic universal patterns. New Age teachers regularly cite Hermetic authority for teachings about energy healing, manifestation, and spiritual evolution that have at best tenuous connection to actual Hermetic texts. This creates tension between historical accuracy and living tradition. Scholars properly object that New Age Hermeticism misrepresents the ancient texts and imports modern ideas anachronistically. Practitioners respond that spiritual truth transcends historical nicety and that they are continuing the tradition of adapting ancient wisdom to contemporary needs. Contemporary interest in consciousness studies, systems theory, and holistic thinking shows Hermetic influence even when not explicitly acknowledged. The view that consciousness is fundamental rather than emergent, property of matter resonates with Hermetic mentalism. Systems approaches that emphasize interconnection, feedback, and emergent properties at multiple scales echo the Hermetic vision of organic cosmos structured according to corresponding patterns. Holistic medicine that treats the person as integrated whole rather than collection of parts, that recognizes psychosomatic connections, that works with subtle energies, draws on conceptual resources the Hermetic tradition helped establish. Contemporary rejection of strict reductionism and recognition that higher levels of organization may exhibit properties not fully explicable by lower-level mechanisms validate aspects of Hermetic cosmology, even as specific Hermetic claims about planetary influences and sympathetic magic remain unsupported by evidence. The question of what remains philosophically live in Hermeticism after modern science and philosophy have rejected so many of its specific claims deserves careful consideration. We cannot return to belief in geocentric astronomy with 7 planetary spheres. We cannot accept that matter is composed of 4 elements with their qualities. We cannot affirm that corresponding planetary influences govern earthly events through cosmic sympathy. We cannot practice talismanic magic expecting results through sympathetic correspondence. These claims are false, or at least empirically unwarranted. Yet several core Hermetic intuitions continue to provoke philosophical reflection. First, the idea that consciousness is ontologically fundamental rather than an accidental byproduct of material complexity remains a live option in philosophy of mind. Panpsychism, idealism, and neutral monism represent contemporary versions of this ancient conviction. Second, the recognition that patterns recur across scales and domains, that understanding one level of organization illuminates others, that the universe exhibits remarkable formal unity despite material diversity, reflects genuine features of reality that modern science confirms even as it explains them differently than Hermetic correspondence theory proposed. Third, the vision of human beings as uniquely positioned between material and spiritual, capable of either degrading into pure animality or ascending to divine consciousness, names a perennial existential situation that remains relevant regardless of our cosmological framework. We do face choices about identification and values that determine what kind of beings we become. Fourth, the emphasis on knowledge as transformative rather than merely informative, on understanding as requiring interior work, not just data accumulation, on the knower needing to change to grasp certain truths, points to genuine epistemological insights. Fifth, the conviction that reality is more unified than it appears, that apparent contradictions and diversities ultimately reconcile at deeper level, that truth is one even if approached through multiple paths, expresses an intellectual and spiritual aspiration that continues to motivate synthetic philosophy and comparative studies. Evaluating Hermeticism's continuing significance requires distinguishing its contingent cosmological claims from its more abstract philosophical principles and existential insights. The specific details of Hermetic cosmology belong to the history of ideas, illuminating how past thinkers tried to make sense of their experience. But the underlying concerns these cosmologies addressed remain perennial. What is the relationship between mind and matter, consciousness and cosmos? How do unity and multiplicity relate? What is the human being, and what is our proper place in reality? Can we achieve radical transformation, or are we trapped by nature and circumstances? These questions ensure that Hermeticism continues speaking to contemporary philosophers and spiritual seekers even after its specific answers have been superseded. We engage Hermeticism not to recover true cosmology, but to encounter serious attempts to articulate comprehensive worldviews that integrate science, philosophy, and spirituality into unified vision. The Hermetic vision of human potential continues to inspire. The teaching that we are divine beings temporarily inhabiting material form, capable through knowledge and virtue of ascending to union with God, challenges both reductive materialism that sees humans as nothing but evolved animals and supernatural theism that maintains unbridgeable gulf between creature and creator. The Hermetic alternative proposes that divinity and humanity exist on continuum, that the same intelligence pervading cosmos operates in human consciousness, that achieving higher consciousness is not violating our nature but fulfilling it. This vision animated Renaissance humanism, Romantic transcendentalism, and continues to attract those seeking middle path between scientific materialism and religious supernaturalism. Whether metaphysically defensible or not, it names a possibility that many find existentially compelling and spiritually empowering. The principle of correspondence, detached from its literal alchemical and astrological applications, survives as recognition that patterns and principles recur across domains. When contemporary scientists discover fractal geometry repeating similar structures at multiple scales, when they find same mathematical forms describing phenomena in different fields, when they trace isomorphisms linking diverse systems, they confirm the essential Hermetic insight even while rejecting Hermetic cosmology. The universe exhibits remarkable formal unity. Understanding nature requires recognizing these patterns and correspondences. The difference lies in how we explain and apply this recognition. Modern science uses empirical investigation and mathematical modeling. Hermetic magic used intuitive correspondence and sympathetic action. But both approaches assume that reality is rationally ordered and that understanding its order provides power. The fate of Hermeticism illustrates broader patterns in how traditions persist, adapt, and transform. Ancient Hermeticism emerged from cultural synthesis between Greek and Egyptian civilization. Medieval Hermeticism developed through Arabic transmission and Islamic philosophical commentary. Renaissance Hermeticism revived through rediscovery of ancient texts misunderstood as more ancient than they were. Early modern Hermeticism went underground as esotericism after loss of mainstream intellectual authority. Contemporary Hermeticism manifests in academic study, psychological interpretation, New Age spirituality, and ongoing esoteric practice. At each stage, the tradition transformed substantially while maintaining certain continuities. The ship of Hermeticism has had nearly all its planks replaced over centuries, yet arguably remains the same vessel. This raises philosophical questions about identity and continuity in intellectual traditions. At what point does adaptation become fundamental alteration? Can traditions remain authentic while changing dramatically? These questions lack definitive answers, but addressing them helps us understand cultural history and contemporary spirituality. Hermeticism reminds us that the history of ideas is not simple progressive movement from error to truth. The Hermetic texts articulated sophisticated philosophy addressing perennial questions. That they were later misunderstood, rejected, revived, adapted, and reinterpreted reflects the complex ways humans create and transmit meaning across time and culture. Hermeticism's influence on Western thought came not despite but through misunderstanding and creative reinterpretation. Renaissance scholars' belief in extreme Hermetic antiquity was historically false but philosophically productive, generating synthesis that shaped intellectual history. This suggests that philosophical and spiritual traditions remain vital through creative engagement rather than rigid preservation. Living traditions adapt to new contexts while maintaining essential commitments. Hermeticism lives today not as museum piece but as resource for contemporary thought precisely because each generation has claimed it for itself and transformed it accordingly. Whether this serves truth or obscures it remains debatable. What seems certain is that Hermetic philosophy will continue attracting attention as long as humans seek comprehensive understanding, integrating knowledge of nature with wisdom about existence, reconciling scientific investigation with spiritual aspiration, pursuing the ancient quest to know both cosmos and self.